Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
Welcome to the best of HOA drama stories from 2024. I hope you enjoy.
In the seemingly serene suburbia of Pinecrest Heights, there existed an HOA, Homeowners Association, that ruled with an iron fist. I, however, was not a member, blissfully ignorant of the bureaucratic behemoth lurking in the shadows. That was until they took a wrecking ball to my garage, triggering a chain of events that would redefine my understanding of nuclear revenge. It all began innocently enough. Nestled in my charming abode, I enjoyed the tranquility of not having to adhere to HOA guidelines, blissfully unaware of their autocratic tendencies. My garage, a testament to my laissez-faire attitude towards aesthetic conformity, stood proudly, housing an eclectic mix of tools, forgotten hobbies, and a collection of vintage arcade games. The trouble started when Mr. Eugene Kensington, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, decided that my garage was a blemish on the immaculate canvas of Pinecrest Heights. An affront to his carefully curated neighborhood utopia. He couldn't stand the sight of my slightly peeling paint and the quirky, hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to the Garage of Wonders." To him, it was an eyesore that needed swift eradication. One fateful morning, as I sipped my coffee and marveled at the unspoken beauty of my chaotic domain, the rumble of heavy machinery shattered the peace. I rushed outside to find a demolition crew, sponsored by the HOA, enthusiastically dismantling my beloved garage. "Hold it right there!" I yelled, aghast at the ruthless assault on my personal space. Mr. Kensington, clad in a perfectly pressed suit, sauntered over with an air of superiority. "This garage is an aberration, an eyesore, and it's coming down for the greater good of Pinecrest Heights. You should have conformed to the guidelines." "But I'm not even a member of the HOA. I have the right to live in nonconformist bliss," I protested. With a dismissive wave, he retorted, "The rules apply to everyone in Pinecrest Heights, member or not. Consider this a favor, a free garage upgrade. Compliments of the HOA." Fueled by rage and an overwhelming sense of injustice, I decided it was time to teach Mr. Kensington and his HOA cronies a lesson they'd never forget. But I wasn't about to stoop to their level. No, I would go for the nuclear option, a legal battle that would shake the very foundations of Pinecrest Heights. Engaging the services of the sharpest lawyer in town, Samantha "Sly" Anderson, I filed a lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, destruction of property, and emotional distress. The courtroom transformed into a battleground, with Sly wielding her legal prowess like a seasoned warrior. The HOA, confident in their bureaucratic fortress, underestimated the fury they had unleashed. The judge, however, wasn't swayed by their polished arguments. Sly presented evidence of their overreach, their disdain for individuality, and the fact that they had targeted a non-member. The courtroom buzzed with tension as my case gained momentum. As the trial reached its climax, Sly delivered a closing statement that resonated like a war cry. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, we stand here not just for a garage but for the very essence of freedom and individuality that makes Pinecrest Heights diverse and unique. The HOA's attempt to homogenize this community is an affront to the principles upon which this nation was built." The judge, tapping his gavel with a sense of satisfaction, ruled in my favor. The HOA was ordered to pay hefty reparations for the demolition, and the court issued a scathing rebuke of their autocratic tendencies. It was a victory for the little guy, a triumph over conformity. However, I wasn't content with just a legal win. No, I had bigger plans for my nuclear revenge. Inspired by the very arcade games that once resided in my garage, I proposed a community-wide event, the Pinecrest Heights Retro Arcade Festival. The festival was a celebration of diversity, individuality, and the joy of nonconformity. With the help of fellow residents, we turned the once destroyed garage site into a vibrant hub of retro arcade games, each one reflecting the unique personalities of its owner. The festival attracted attention far beyond Pinecrest Heights, earning support from neighboring communities and even making headlines in the local news. The HOA, realizing they had unwittingly fueled a rebellion, attempted damage control, but it was too late. The festival became an annual tradition, a testament to the resilience of a community that refused to be stifled by bureaucratic norms. As for Mr. Kensington, he faded into the background, a humbled figure in the face of a community that had discovered the strength in embracing its quirks. The nuclear revenge I sought turned out to be not the destruction of an enemy but the creation of something beautiful, a reminder that sometimes it takes a little chaos to reveal the true colors of a community. And in Pinecrest Heights, those colors were more vibrant than ever before.
Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
For months it felt like we were on a roller coaster of nonsense, and no matter how hard we tried to follow their rules, the HOA found a new way to come down on us. The final straw came one sunny afternoon when I was outside minding my business, spreading some new mulch in the front yard. I was just about done feeling proud of the fresh look when I noticed Karen, a name that still sends a chill down my spine, swarming toward me, clipboard in hand. The HOA's self-appointed watchdog looked ready to explode. "You know that's the wrong color mulch, right?" she barked, pointing her pen accusingly at the ground. I looked at the mulch, deep dark brown, a nice contrast to the green of the grass and the plants. I thought it looked great. "What do you mean, wrong color?" I asked, genuinely confused. "It's supposed to be red," Karen replied with a huff, tapping her clipboard. "The HOA regulations clearly state that all mulch visible from the street must be red cedar. This," she waved her pen dramatically, "is not red cedar." I stared at her for a moment, utterly dumbfounded. "You've got to be kidding me. You're really going to fine me over mulch?" "It's not about the fine," she said in a tone that suggested it was very much about the fine. "It's about maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood." "Well, I'm not changing it," I said flatly. "It's mulch. No one cares." Karen narrowed her eyes at me. "You'll be receiving a violation notice in the mail, and if you don't comply within 10 days you'll be fined." And with that she marched off, clipboard clutched like a weapon of mass destruction. I stood there, fuming. How could anyone care so much about something as trivial as mulch? But that's how it was with the HOA. They wanted to control every little detail, right down to the type of plants we could have in our yard and the color of our fences. It was like living under a dictatorship. That night I vented my frustrations to my neighbor Ed. He lived a couple of houses down and had his own battles with the HOA. We sat on his porch, beers in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I'm sick of it," I muttered, taking a swig from my bottle. "Every time I turn around there's a new violation or fine. I can't keep up." Ed nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "Same here. They fined me last month because my kids' bikes were left on the front lawn for a couple of hours. It's ridiculous. Is there even a way out of this?" I asked. "Or are we just stuck dealing with this crap forever?" Ed leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Actually, I've been doing some digging, and I think I've found a way out." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, do tell." "So I was looking through the HOA bylaws, don't ask me why, I just get bored sometimes, and I noticed something interesting. The HOA's jurisdiction is tied to whether or not you're connected to the community well. If you're on the well, they can enforce their rules. But if you're not," he let the sentence hang in the air, "if you're not, they can't," I finished, my interest piqued. "So what, we just disconnect from the well?" "Exactly," Ed said, grinning. "We connect to municipal water instead. It's going to take some work, and it's not going to be cheap, but I've already talked to a lawyer and a plumber. If we get enough people on board, we can make it happen." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around it. "How much are we talking?" "At first, it looked like about $12,000 per house," Ed said. "But I found a government grant that could help cover some of the cost. And if we negotiate as a group, we can probably get the price down to around $3,000 per house." That number still made my stomach churn a little, but the thought of being free from the HOA's control was too tempting to pass up. "So what's the plan?" Ed leaned forward, lowering his voice as if Karen herself might be listening from behind the bushes. "We get everyone on the street involved. The more memal we have, the better our chances of negotiating a lower price. And if we pull this off, we're out. No more fines, no more violations. We're free." Over the next few weeks, Ed and I became the ringleaders of what felt like a neighborhood rebellion. We knocked on doors, made phone calls, and gathered as many people as we could. Most of the neighbors were just as fed up as we were, and it didn't take much convincing to get them on board. There were a few holdouts, of course. People who didn't want to spend the money or didn't think it was worth the hassle. But for the most part, the response was overwhelmingly positive. We organized meetings in Ed's garage, mapping out our strategy and discussing the logistics of disconnecting from the well. The lawyer we hired was optimistic, and the plumber assured us that the work could be done in a few weeks once we had everything lined up. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with our plan. Karen naturally was furious. The day she found out about our little rebellion, she showed up at one of our meetings barging in like she owned the place. "What do you people think you're doing?" she demanded, waving her clipboard around like a sword. "You can't just disconnect from the well. That's HOA property. You're violating the bylaws." Ed calmly stood up, crossing his arms over his chest. "Actually, Karen, we're not violating anything. The bylaws clearly state that only homes connected to the well are subject to the HOA's rules. If we're not connected to the well, we're not under their control." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. She slammed her clipboard down on the table, making everyone jump. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she screeched. "This is outrageous, unacceptable. Do you have any idea what you're doing to our beautiful community?" She started pacing back and forth, her voice rising with every word. "I've spent years making this neighborhood perfect. Perfect lawns, perfect houses, perfect people. And you want to throw it all away because you can't follow a few simple rules." Karen whirled around, pointing an accusing finger at each of us in turn. "You'll regret this, mark my words. Without the HOA, this place will turn into a trashy trailer park faster than you can blink. You'll have cars on blocks in every driveway, weeds taller than your children, and God forbid, pink flamingos on every lawn." Her tirade continued, growing more hysterical by the second. "Property values will plummet, criminals will move in, before you know it, we'll be living in a ghetto. Is that what you want, to destroy everything we've built here?" By now, Karen was practically foaming at the mouth, her carefully coiffed hair coming undone. "I won't stand for this. I'll sue every last one of you. I'll call the mayor, the governor, the president if I have to. This neighborhood will stay under HOA control if it's the last thing I do." "We're not planning on letting the neighborhood fall apart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We just want to live without being micromanaged." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, and for a moment I thought she might actually throw her clipboard at me. But instead she spun on her heel and stormed out, muttering something about legal action as she went. The city trucks rolled in about a month later, and the sight of them tearing up the street to lay new water lines was like a breath of fresh air. We stood on our porches watching the machinery rumble past, knowing that freedom was finally within our grasp. As the work progressed, other streets on the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction started getting ideas. Word spread quickly, and before long, more and more homes were disconnecting from the well, finding ways to either connect to municipal water or dig their own private wells. The HOA's power was crumbling, and there was nothing Karen or anyone else could do to stop it. By the time the work was finished, our street looked completely different. The lines had been redrawn, and the HOA's map looked like Swiss cheese, with chunks of homes here and there no longer under their control. Karen tried to fight it, of course. She filed complaints with the city, threatened lawsuits, and even went door to door, trying to convince people that we were ruining the neighborhood. But no one was listening anymore. We were free. One afternoon, not long after the water lines were complete, Karen showed up at my house again. This time she didn't look angry. She looked tired, defeated. "You think you've won," she said, standing on my porch with that familiar clipboard in hand. "But you've destroyed this neighborhood. You'll see. Without the HOA, this place is going to fall apart." I didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at her. "We didn't destroy anything," I said finally. "We just wanted to live without being constantly harassed. That's not too much to ask." Karen's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little," she sputtered, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her clipboard. Suddenly, she lunged forward, swinging the clipboard at my head. I ducked just in time, feeling the whoosh of air as it sailed past my ear. "Karen, stop," I yelled, backing away, but she was beyond reason now, her eyes wild with fury. She came at me again, this time with her fists. I managed to grab her wrist, trying to hold her off without hurting her. "Someone call the police," I shouted, hoping my neighbors would hear. Karen was screaming incoherently now, a mix of threats and insults. She managed to wrench one hand free and slapped me hard across the face. The sting of it shocked me and I stumbled backward. Just then I heard sirens in the distance. My next-door neighbor Bill came running up. "I called the cops," he panted. "What the hell is going on?" Karen whirled on Bill, her clipboard raised like a weapon. "You're all traitors," she shrieked. "This was a beautiful community until you ruined it." The police car screeched to a halt in front of my house. 2 officers jumped out, quickly assessing the situation. "Ma'am, put down the clipboard and step away," one of them ordered. For a moment I thought Karen might actually attack the cops. But then, as if all the fight suddenly drained out of her, she dropped the clipboard and sank to her knees, sobbing. As the officers handcuffed Karen and led her to the patrol car, I stood there, stunned. This wasn't how I'd imagined our HOA saga ending. I felt a mix of relief, pity, and a strange sense of sadness. The neighborhood would never be the same after this, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. And that was it. We were free. Free from the endless fines, the ridiculous rules, the constant feeling of being watched. We had taken control of our lives, and in the process, we had weakened the HOA's grip on the entire neighborhood. The change was immediate. The next morning, I heard laughter outside, a sound that had been rare in our community. Kids were playing freely in their yards, and neighbors were chatting without the usual tension. Old Mr. Johnson finally painted his shutters the bright blue he'd always wanted, while Mrs. Rodriguez hung her laundry on a clothesline. Something that would have earned her a fine just days before. Looking back, I still can't believe we pulled it off. We rallied an entire street, took on the HOA, and won. We found a way out, and in doing so, we showed everyone that you don't have to live under someone else's rules. You can take control, you just have to be willing to fight for it. It was a lesson in courage and unity that transformed not just our street, but the spirit of our entire community. These HOA jerks got what they deserved. I'm sick of these power-tripping losers telling people what color their houses gotta be and how short their grass needs to be. It's like they got nothing better to do than measure grass with a ruler. Good on these folks for sticking it to 'em. I wish I could do the same in my neighborhood, but our HOAs got us locked down tight. Maybe I need to start digging for loopholes too. Anyone know a good lawyer who hates HOAs as much as I do? Seriously though, this story's got me fired up. Time to rally the troops in my hood and see if we can pull off something similar. Power to the people, man. I find this story highly improbable. The author claims they managed to disconnect 44 houses from a community well and connect them to municipal water for merely $3,000 per household. That's absurdly low. Furthermore, the idea that a government grant would cover such a project for a relatively affluent neighborhood is questionable at best. The legal implications of suddenly leaving an HOA en masse are also glossed over. Any competent HOA would have safeguards against such actions in their bylaws. The timeline presented is also suspiciously vague. Such a large-scale infrastructure project would take months, if not years, to plan and execute. The author's casual tone when describing complex legal and civic processes further strains credibility. While I sympathize with the frustration many feel towards overbearing HOAs, this story reads more like a fantasy than a factual account. I'd be interested in seeing any corroborating evidence or news reports about this supposed Swiss cheese HOA. Oh my God, this is hilarious. Those HOA snobs must have been losing their minds. I can just picture their faces turning red and steam coming out of their ears like in cartoons. Serves them right for being such control freaks. I bet they were running around like headless chickens trying to figure out how to stop it. And the image of the HOA map looking like Swiss cheese, I'm dying. This is the kind of petty revenge I live for. Whoever came up with this idea is a genius. I hope this spreads to other neighborhoods and we see more HOAs crumbling. Keep fighting the good fight, y'all.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.
This incident happened in January of this year. Last year I moved into a neighborhood with an optional HOA. At the time I'd come into enough money to buy a house outright. The only reason I moved here is because the HOA was optional, and it's a nice safe neighborhood. It's a slice of heaven compared to where I used to live. I own 2 vehicles, a 2004 Toyota Camry, and a 1999 Ford F-150. The Camry is my daily driver, while the F-150 is my hauler for when I need it. I bought the truck around the same time I bought the house to help with the move. And I used it to pull a rented trailer when I was moving my stuff in. The F-150 is old, but in good mechanical order. And I try to keep both of my vehicles clean with monthly trips through a car wash. The local HOA did not like me from the start due to my refusal to join. The HOA president was a retired old man who seemed like he had nothing better to do. So he tried multiple times to sell me on joining, and sent me several applications in the mail. But I always declined, politely at first. But when the president got more aggressive, I told him to shove it where the sun doesn't shine. That's when the HOA decided that I was a member anyway, and started sending me fines in the mail with that claim. I knew they were bogus, so I went to the next HOA meeting to dispute the fines. They tried to tell me that by living here, I'm in the HOA whether I liked it or not. This was an obvious power move, and something I was ready for. I could only laugh in amazement of their stupidity, and said as much to them. Then told the board that not only was I not a member, but I'd gotten a lawyer to write up a C&D for them. I handed the envelope over, the board skimmed it, then furiously told me to get out. The fines stopped for a few months, then started right back up again at random. So I popped into another HOA meeting and told them this was not legal, I'm not in their HOA, and I'd take them to court if they didn't stop. And once again I was furiously told to get out. The fines stopped for good, but the HOA president decided I needed to be made an example of. It happened only a few days later. I came home to find my F-150 gone from my driveway. I checked my cameras and saw the HOA president himself walk onto my property. He took out a pocket knife and stabbed each of my truck's tires in the sidewalls, then unscrewed the license plates off, put them in a bag and just casually walked away with them. Then a little while later a tow truck came and hauled my truck away. I called the police, and together we went to see the HOA president. But he wasn't home. With my situation explained, this was not considered a civil matter, but grand theft auto. The police traced the tow truck as being from a local junkyard, and not from an impound lot. I accompanied the police there. Not only was the HOA president present at the junkyard, but my F-150 was there being taken apart by about 4 men. They'd already removed the headlights, hood, bumper, radiator, and all of the panels off the front of the truck by the time we'd gotten there. There was stuff disconnected all over the engine bay, and the catalytic converters had already been cut out. The HOA president looked like a deer in headlights when he saw me there with police. I was nearly angry beyond words when I saw my truck in that condition. Nearly I say, because I went off like a foul-mouthed country sailor on the people who had ripped my truck apart. The HOA president was caught red-handed, but insisted he'd only towed my truck because it was in a sorry state and looked abandoned. I said he illegally took it off my private property since the HOA had no right to tow off my land, and he clearly had not been aware of my cameras, as they'd seen everything he did. He went pale at first, then furiously tried to stomp towards me looking like he was ready for a fight while yelling my truck had been an eyesore, so he got rid of it. This action earned him some new bracelets and a free ride to the station. The police were somewhat merciful to the junkyard staff, who claimed to have only been doing their jobs. The owner of the junkyard is a cousin to the HOA president. So he was contracted to do any towing for the HOA since he also owned a local impound. He had no idea I wasn't a member of the HOA, and also was not aware his cousin had ordered his employees to tear my truck apart for parts as an abandoned vehicle. The police cited all sorts of broken laws to the employees and owner, and then they agreed to put my truck back together. But I said that it had better be at least as good as it was, if not better, or I'd be going to my lawyer. The owner told his employees to do whatever it takes, or he'd separate them from their jobs. Then told me he'd bill the HOA president for everything later. Then the police and I got to watch as all of those employees had to painstakingly put my truck back together piece by piece. And they repeatedly muttered things about me to each other and flashed me the stink eye from time to time. I'm guessing the HOA president offered to bribe them all to take my truck apart as quickly as possible. But now they had to fix it for free. And they were at it for hours. They had to weld the catalytic converters back in, and even had to replace some parts entirely due to damage caused during hasty disassembly. When they first fired up the engine, it had an obvious misfire. They denied it, but police sided with me that they could tell it had a misfire too. Turns out they ruined one of the coil packs taking the truck apart, and they had to order new parts from a nearby auto parts store to fix it. One of the headlights also stopped working. Again, something that they had to fix because I stated I could prove with my home cameras that they were both working when I last drove it. And the bulbs were nearly brand new LEDs. So they had to have broken something. The coolant lines had also been just cut instead of simply disconnected. Probably because they were trying to take the truck apart in a hurry. So those were more parts that had to be ordered from the nearby store as well. I can only imagine the total cost that was billed to the HOA president for this. All 4 of the tires had to be replaced because they were not repairable. So they had to leave the truck on a lift and take all 4 wheels off. There were other problems too. And all of these junkyard mechanics had to work overtime to put the truck back together on the hopes I wouldn't sue or press charges. I wasn't even able to take the truck home till the next day evening, because the police had to get my plates back, and the junkyard staff had to take the wheels in for new tires. By the time I got the truck back, the 2 junkyard employees I saw there gave me looks that just said not to come back. And the truck actually runs better than before. So I essentially got a free sorta overhaul for my trouble. As for the HOA president, well, I did sue him for trespassing, theft, destruction of property and the illegal tow. He ended up paying his cousin for all of my truck repairs, lost his position in the HOA, and moved out of the neighborhood shortly after losing the lawsuit because he had no leg to stand on in court since everything was caught on CCTV. He pretty much surrendered to the asked for settlement, which is why it didn't get drawn out. The HOA has not bothered me at all since the truck incident. And my neighbors love me for getting rid of the old HOA president as he was a power-tripping narcissist to them all, and kept issuing pointless fines that had to be regularly disputed. Also, I have been back to that junkyard for parts. But for my Camry instead, as I went to pull a replacement grille for it, and found one in excellent shape there. They did recognize me, and gave me dirty looks. But otherwise didn't bother me.
When I first got the keys to my new place, it felt like a dream come true. I had finally escaped the suffocating grip of an HOA, or so I thought. The townhouse was in an unincorporated area, which I figured meant a little more freedom. No one breathing down my neck about the color of my front door or the length of my grass. But as it turns out, there was a catch, a big one. The place wasn't exactly HOA-free. It was part of a townhouse association which, while technically different from an HOA, might as well have been the same beast with a different name. The association agreement had a nifty little clause that required any potential purchaser to sign an assumption agreement before the title transfer. That meant you had to agree to take on all the seller's obligations, including joining the association. No signature, no sale. Simple as that. Well, the board must have been napping when my paperwork came through because they missed that minor detail. I never signed the assumption agreement. Yet somehow they went ahead and approved the title transfer. The moment I found out, a grin spread across my face that I couldn't wipe off if I tried. They'd screwed up big time, and I was now the proud owner of a townhouse without being shackled to the association. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, something they'd catch and fix before I could even unpack. But nope, the board didn't seem to realize their colossal blunder. They handed me the keys and probably didn't even give it a second thought. It turns out that they had just lost the only leverage they had over me. I decided to keep my mouth shut, not wanting to draw attention to the oversight. Instead, I settled into my new place, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd slipped through their bureaucratic fingers. But as the days passed, I started to wonder what this really meant. I did some research, contacted a lawyer friend, and the more I learned, the more the situation amused me. Legally, I owned the property outright. But because I hadn't signed that agreement, I wasn't technically a member of the Townhouse Association. And since I hadn't agreed to join, they couldn't force me to. They'd lost their chance when they approved the title transfer. Without that assumption agreement, their power over me was as good as dead. The kicker, I wasn't just a rogue homeowner now. I was a tenant in common with the entire association. In layman's terms, this meant that for any decision the association wanted to make that affected the property, especially if it was going to cost me money, I had to agree. Otherwise, it was a no-go. I had inadvertently given myself veto power over the board and every other owner in the community. It was like I was holding the remote to their TV, and they didn't even know it yet. I wasn't just free from their rules. I had the potential to disrupt their entire operation. I could already picture the looks on their faces when they finally realized what they'd done. But I wasn't in a hurry to enlighten them. Why spoil the fun? A couple of weeks passed before the board finally caught wind of what had happened. I received a politely worded letter from the association president, Karen. Of course her name was Karen, asking me to rectify the situation by signing the assumption agreement retroactively. Her tone was sugary sweet, but the underlying message was clear. They wanted their power back, and they expected me to just hand it over. I ignored the letter at first, letting it sit on my kitchen counter while I pondered my next move. After all, what were they going to do? They couldn't untransfer the title, and they certainly couldn't force me to sign something I hadn't agreed to in the first place. Karen, however, wasn't the type to give up easily. Another letter arrived, this one less polite, hinting at potential consequences if I didn't comply. Now, I'm not one to back down from a fight, especially not when I'm in the right, but I had no intention of turning this into a full-blown legal battle. I decided to have a little fun instead. I called Karen directly, and as soon as she heard my voice, I could sense her irritation simmering beneath her professional demeanor. I played dumb, pretending I hadn't received her letters, which only made her more flustered. "Oh, those must have gotten lost in the mail. You know how unreliable the postal service can be these days," I said, barely suppressing a laugh. Karen wasn't amused. She launched into a spiel about how important it was for the integrity of the community that all owners be members of the association, how it was in everyone's best interest that I sign the agreement, blah blah blah. I let her talk, occasionally throwing in a non-committal or I see, just to keep her going. When she finally paused for breath, I decided to drop the bombshell. "You know, Karen, I've been doing some research, and it turns out there's nothing you can do to make me sign that agreement now. You had your chance before the title transfer, but now, well, let's just say I'm in a pretty unique position." The silence on the other end of the line was priceless. I could practically hear the gears in Karen's head grinding to a halt as she processed what I'd just said. "What do you mean?" she finally asked, her voice a little less confident than before. "I mean, I own the property, but I'm not part of your association. Legally, I'm a tenant in common with the association, not with the other owners. So any decisions that affect the property or would cost me money, yeah, you need my approval for those." Karen's response was immediate and predictable. She sputtered and stammered, trying to regain her composure, but it was clear she hadn't anticipated this. She tried to argue that I was still bound by the rules of the association, but I wasn't having any of it. I calmly explained that without the assumption agreement, their rules didn't apply to me. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, Karen," I said, savoring the moment. "You see, the only power you had to force me into the association was withholding the title transfer. But since you approved it without my signature, there's really nothing left for you to do. I'm not bound by your rules, and you can't compel me to join." I could almost hear her grinding her teeth on the other end of the line. There was a long pause before she finally spoke again, her tone much icier than before. "This isn't over," she said. "We'll see about this." And with that, she hung up. I had to admit that little exchange left me feeling pretty smug. But I knew this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat, and I had no doubt she'd be scheming with the other board members to find a way to get their control back. The funny thing was, the more they pushed, the more I realized just how much power I actually had in this situation. And I wasn't about to give it up without a fight. Over the next few weeks, things started to heat up. Karen and the board sent more letters, each one more desperate than the last. They threatened fines, legal action, even hinted at foreclosure. But it was all bluster. My lawyer friend assured me they didn't have a leg to stand on. Without that assumption agreement, they were barking up the wrong tree. The best part, I started getting wind of the gossip swirling around the neighborhood. The other owners were catching on that something was up, and speculation was running wild. Some thought I was some kind of legal mastermind who had found a loophole to exploit the system. Others assumed I was just a lucky idiot who had no idea what I was doing. But one thing was clear. I had become the talk of the town, and Karen was not happy about it. It wasn't long before the board decided to call a special meeting to discuss the situation. I wasn't officially invited, of course, since I wasn't a member of the association, but I showed up anyway. After all, as a legal owner, I had every right to attend and voice my opinion. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that did nothing to soften the tension in the air. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, with Karen right in the middle, glaring at me as I walked in. The other owners were seated in rows of folding chairs, whispering among themselves as I took a seat near the back. Karen wasted no time getting to the point. She launched into a long-winded explanation of the association's rules and how important it was for everyone to comply. She didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. Her voice dripped with barely concealed contempt as she described the serious issue facing the community. And so, she concluded, it's imperative that we take action to ensure that all owners are held to the same standards. We cannot allow one individual to undermine the integrity of this association. I could feel the eyes of the other owners on me as Karen spoke, but I wasn't about to let her have the last word. As soon as she opened the floor for comments, I stood up and cleared my throat. "Excuse me, Karen, but I think it's important to clarify a few things," I began, my voice calm but firm. "First of all, I'm not trying to undermine anything. I simply didn't sign the assumption agreement, and the board approved the title transfer anyway. That's on you, not me." The room fell silent as I spoke, and Karen's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before, but I wasn't done. "Second," I continued, "I'm well within my legal rights to refuse to sign anything now. The board had their chance and they missed it. So as far as I'm concerned, this issue is resolved." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't finished yet. "Lastly," I said, turning to address the other owners, "I want to make it clear that I have no intention of causing problems for anyone, but I'm not going to be bullied into signing something I don't have to. The board made a mistake, and now they're trying to make me pay for it. That's not going to happen." There was a murmur of agreement from a few of the owners, but Karen wasn't about to back down. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't about bullying," she snapped. "It's about fairness. Everyone else in this community has to follow the rules, and you should be no different," I shrugged. "Fairness works both ways, Karen. If the board had followed their own rules, we wouldn't be in this situation. But they didn't, and now here we are." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen looked like she was about to explode, but before she could say anything else, one of the other board members, a guy named Tom, stood up and tried to play peacemaker. "Look, let's all just take a step back," Tom said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "We need to figure out a solution that works for everyone. Maybe there's a way to come to some kind of agreement." But Karen wasn't having it. She shot Tom a withering look and turned back to me. "There's only one solution," she hissed. "You sign the agreement, or there will be consequences." I raised an eyebrow. "Consequences like what?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "You'll see." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. The other board members looked around awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. Tom cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was clear that the mood had shifted. The owners were no longer just curious. They were starting to get angry, and not at me. As I left the clubhouse that night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karen might have thought she could intimidate me, but all she'd done was dig herself a deeper hole. The more she pushed, the more the other owners started to see through her power trip, and the best part, this was far from over. Did they? I'm not sure they know the full ramifications of this, if I'm understanding it correctly. It sounds like OP is 50% share, and then everyone else under the association is 50%. Does that mean if there is some big cost, OP has now 50% responsibility to it, like it works with condo voting when weighted, and my deed set up as tenant in common with the spouse? He also doesn't have effective veto. He just has the same say, and they will be deadlocked and court hash it out, which also sounds expensive for OP if they don't just roll over. For examples, let's assume the association owns the roads and it is time to pave them. It comes to a total of $500,000. The association has to come up with $250,000. OP has to come up with $250,000 themselves. He votes no, of course, and they are deadlocked, so the association asks for mediation, and now OP has expensive legal bills and a $250,000 debt on top. Because mediation, they will lose here. No mediation is going to pick OP's no. OP probably also has to approve sales now and exposing themselves to personal lawsuits if they refuse when again they are deadlocked on votes. It just doesn't seem like a win unless you have screw money. Funny still, and I might torture them briefly, but I think I'd want it fixed. I mean, he is still attached to the hip with that association. That's what I instantly thought of as well. There are certain things that an HOA should do. especially in a townhouse association that is probably responsible for the outside structures. This is a with great power comes great responsibility. To OP, I'd make sure that the things that need to get fixed do. You don't want to delay maintenance on something that causes a major issue down the road that costs a lot more. However, where HOAs really go downhill is when they start to become control freaks. And this is where OP can shine. Make sure they don't enact any BS or assess any special assessments for personal pet projects. OP is in a great position here and can essentially run the HOA. Typical HOA BS, these power-hungry jerks think they can control every little thing about our lives. Paint colors, plants, flags, give me a break. It's my property. I paid for it. Good on this guy for finding a loophole. Maybe now the rest of the neighborhood will wake up and realize how ridiculous these rules are. HOAs are just a way for nosy neighbors to feel important and boss everyone around. I bet that Karen has nothing better to do than measure people's grass with a ruler. And those fees, highway robbery, they're probably using that money for fancy dinners and not actually improving anything. I hope this guy stands his ground and doesn't give in to their bullying. Maybe he can use his new veto power to get rid of some of these stupid rules. It's about time someone stood up to these mini dictators. If I ever buy a house, you can bet I'm staying far away from any neighborhood with an HOA. Freedom over fascism, baby.
Atop the hill, where the earth seemed to cradle history in its contours, stood Donald Yates, a man whose stoic demeanor echoed the countless stories etched into the very fabric of the land he proudly called home. His face, weathered by the passage of time and the trials of life, bore witness to the generational journey embedded in the sprawling expanse beneath him. As the sun gracefully dipped below the horizon, its final golden rays painted the scene with hues of amber, casting long shadows that danced upon the undulating terrain of the vast 100 acres. This expansive patch of earth had been an unwavering part of the Yates family legacy for well over a century, witnessing the ebb and flow of seasons, and cradling the dreams and aspirations of those who came before him. Amidst this captivating landscape, a recently rebuilt house stood as a testament to the harmonious coexistence of the past and present. A beacon of modernity nestled among ancient sentinels, the towering trees that had witnessed the passing of time and bore silent witness to the family's enduring connection to the land. The creek, a sinuous thread of life meandering through the heart of his estate, added a soothing melody to the picturesque tableau. As the day transformed into night, the juxtaposition of the contemporary dwelling against the backdrop of the time-honored natural elements created a scene of enchanting contrast, inviting contemplation of the intricate tapestry woven by the passage of time on the canvas of Donald's familial heritage. The serenity that had once enveloped the evening like a comforting shroud was abruptly shattered by the distant, dissonant hum of bulldozers and the metallic clinking that echoed through the air, a discordant symphony signaling the unwelcome intrusion of the Homeowners Association, HOA. To Donald, a man who had cultivated a profound connection to the land that cradled his family's legacy, this abrupt departure from the accustomed tranquility was both alarming and unsettling. What made it all the more perplexing was the realization that he wasn't even a member of this imposing association, yet here it was, casting its industrial shadow over his cherished domain. As he descended the hill, each step seemed to carry a weighty sense of foreboding, as if the very earth beneath him resonated with the disquiet coursing through his veins. The once crisp evening air now bore the unmistakable scent of tension, an invisible thread weaving through the landscape, binding the man and the land in a shared sense of disquiet. The encroachment of the HOA's heavy machinery clashed starkly with the natural rhythm of the environment, creating a jarring juxtaposition that Donald, with furrowed brow and a gaze fixed on the unfolding scene, couldn't quite reconcile. In the midst of this unexpected disruption, the shadows cast by the setting sun seemed to elongate and twist, mirroring the complexity of emotions that surged within him. It was as if the very essence of his familial history was under siege by the mechanized intrusion, and Donald found himself caught in the middle of a battle between tradition and the relentless march of modernity. The evening, once a haven of peace, now stood as a canvas painted with conflict and uncertainty, leaving Donald to navigate the uncharted waters of an unexpected challenge to the sanctity of his ancestral home. As Donald neared the boundaries of his cherished property, a wave of disbelief washed over him, rivaling the turbulent waters that now encircled his once idyllic abode. The once tranquil creek, a natural haven that meandered peacefully through his land, had fallen victim to a ruthless and calculated assault. Its gentle currents, now diverted with an efficiency bordering on malevolence, surged relentlessly towards his residence, transforming it into an unintended island amidst the unforgiving floodwaters. The modern architectural masterpiece that had proudly adorned his landscape for a mere decade now found itself ensnared in the relentless grip of a watery siege, its once solid foundations gradually succumbing to the relentless force of the encroaching tide. A potent mix of rage and bewilderment coursed through Donald as he surveyed the surreal scene before him. It was a tableau of devastation, orchestrated by unseen hands with a nefarious agenda. In the midst of this aquatic onslaught, he uncovered a shocking revelation: the Homeowners Association, HOA, typically a steward of community well-being, had become an unlikely adversary. Motivated by a clandestine agenda, they had devised a sinister plan to devalue his property, paving the way for an opportunistic acquisition. The creek diversion, he realized with a sickening clarity, was not a random act of nature but a tactical maneuver, an insidious ploy to exploit the vulnerability of his once secure home. The realization fueled his anger, transforming the flooding disaster from a mere natural calamity into a deliberate act of betrayal. A conflagration of fury blazed within Donald, an inferno fueled by the gross injustice that had befallen his cherished property. However, rather than succumbing to the visceral urge for immediate retaliation, he steeled himself and embraced a more strategic approach. In a decisive moment, he resolved to wage a battle that transcended the impulsive, opting instead for a calculated response that would harness the very systems the Homeowners Association, HOA, had attempted to manipulate to his disadvantage. With a resolute determination, Donald channeled his anger into a purposeful pursuit of justice. His first strategic move was to engage the formidable resources of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and other pertinent government agencies. These entities, traditionally guardians of environmental integrity and regulatory compliance, became potent allies in his quest for retribution. In orchestrating this alliance, Donald sought not merely restitution for his own losses but also the unmasking of the clandestine machinations that had transpired. The scope of his fight extended beyond personal vendetta. It evolved into a noble endeavor to safeguard the principles of justice and uphold the integrity of communal and environmental regulations. As he navigated the labyrinth of bureaucratic processes, Donald's resilience and conviction blossomed into a beacon of hope against the shadowy forces that had conspired against him. Each document submitted, every meeting attended, and all the meticulous evidence compiled became a testament to his unwavering commitment to exposing wrongdoing and holding the perpetrators accountable. The journey was arduous, fraught with legal intricacies and bureaucratic red tape, but Donald pressed forward undeterred, his quest for justice mirroring the resilience of his imperiled home amidst the encroaching floodwaters. A labyrinthine tapestry of legal battles unfurled, a multidimensional dance that wove together the intricate threads of truth and deception, justice and corruption. The lawsuit initiated by Donald against the Homeowners Association, HOA, metamorphosed into a colossal undertaking, a legal odyssey where every page bore witness to the indomitable spirit of a man determined to safeguard not only his property but also the storied legacy of generations that had preceded him. Each legal maneuver became a strategic step in this high-stakes chess game, where the pawns were legal precedents, the bishops were ethical considerations, and the knights were swift motions of advocacy. In the courtroom, the air crackled with tension as Donald's legal team meticulously presented a case that transcended the boundaries of a mere property dispute. It was a symphony of evidence, each note resonating with the echoes of historical significance and familial heritage. The documents filed were not mere legal paperwork, they were manuscripts chronicling the blood, sweat, and tears invested in building and nurturing a haven that now faced the perilous threat of devaluation. The courtroom itself became a battleground, a theater where the clash between right and wrong played out in the hallowed halls of justice. Donald, flanked by his legal advocates, emerged as a modern-day crusader, wielding not a sword, but the weight of irrefutable evidence and the power of articulate argumentation. The echoes of legal arguments reverberated like thunder, challenging the very foundations of the HOA's clandestine agenda. The lawsuit, far from being a mundane legal process, transformed into an epic narrative of resilience and defiance. With every passing day, it became a living testament to the endurance of one man's fight against the machinations of a seemingly omnipotent homeowners association. The legal battlefield, once a sterile environment of statutes and regulations, now pulsated with the life force of a community's struggle for justice. In the face of this legal maelstrom, Donald stood resolute, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged, as he endeavored to unravel the complexities of the legal dance between right and wrong. As the legal proceedings stretched on, the HOA's shady dealings began to unravel. Secrets hidden in the shadows came to light, revealing a web of deceit and collusion. The HOA, it seemed, was working hand in glove with a developer whose practices teetered on the brink of legality, all in an effort to force Donald off his land. The courtroom became an arena of conflicting narratives, with the developer attempting to justify their actions while Donald stood resolute, a pillar of unwavering determination. The size of his land, the forest that bore witness to centuries of family history, and the creek that once symbolized continuity became the centerpiece of the legal drama. As the trial reached its zenith, evidence mounted against the HOA and their developer ally. The court found in favor of Donald, awarding him a significant settlement of $650,000 as compensation for the damages inflicted upon his property and the emotional toll exacted by the malicious actions of those who sought to exploit him. However, the sweet taste of victory transcended the mere realm of financial gain. It reverberated as a resounding triumph of justice over deceit and resilience over manipulation. In the aftermath of the legal battle, Donald, once an embattled landowner, metamorphosed into more than just a victor in a property dispute. He emerged as an emblematic figure, a living testament to the indomitable spirit that defies corruption and stands tall against the relentless torrent of injustice. The victory, when viewed through the lens of Donald's relentless pursuit of truth, unfolded as a narrative that surpassed the boundaries of a legal win. It echoed with the resonance of a moral victory, a vindication of principles that transcended the tangible confines of mere monetary compensation. Each legal argument presented, each document meticulously examined, became a brushstroke in the portrait of a man who had weathered the storm of deceit with unwavering tenacity. Donald, against the backdrop of legal skirmishes and strategic maneuvers, emerged not merely as a landowner reclaiming his property but as an enduring symbol of tenacity and principled defiance. His story became a parable, circulating through the community and beyond, inspiring others to stand tall against the machinations of corruption and manipulation. As the legal dust settled, the once besieged man now stood as a beacon of hope, a living testament to the idea that justice, when pursued with unwavering determination, can triumph over the most insidious forms of deceit. The community rallied around Donald, not just as a neighbor but as a symbol of collective strength in the face of adversity. The victory, engraved in the annals of local lore, became a rallying cry for those who dared to challenge the status quo, casting Donald as a modern-day hero whose legacy extended far beyond the boundaries of his property. With the legal battles finally behind him, Donald set about restoring his property to its former glory. The creek was redirected to its original course, and the scars inflicted upon the land began to heal. The ancient trees stood tall, a testament to the endurance of nature and the strength of a family that had weathered the storm. In the aftermath, the HOA faced its own reckoning. Exposed for their duplicitous machinations, they were held accountable for their actions, facing legal consequences that reverberated through the community. The developer, too, faced scrutiny, their shady practices coming under the spotlight of public scrutiny. As for Donald, the settlement he received allowed him not only to repair the damages but also to fortify his property against future encroachments. The legacy of his family, spanning over a century, endured, and the lessons learned from the ordeal were etched into the very soil he walked upon. In the quiet aftermath, Donald stood on the hill once again, gazing over his land. The creek flowed freely, and the forest whispered tales of resilience and triumph. The modern house, rebuilt and reinforced, stood as a testament to the indomitable spirit of a man who had fought not just for his property but for the principles that defined him. The echoes of his victory resonated beyond the boundaries of his land, becoming a cautionary tale for those who would seek to exploit the vulnerable and a beacon of hope for those who believed in the enduring power of justice.
When my friend told me he'd found a new construction home, his excitement was contagious. He gushed about the neighborhood, the beautiful houses, and the promise of a community. It all sounded too good to be true. But there was one thing that made me pause. The HOA, it's only here to manage the retention basin, he said, as if that was supposed to ease my mind. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Something didn't sit right, but I kept my thoughts to myself. My friend was over the moon, and I didn't want to burst his bubble. A few months passed, and the honeymoon phase with his new home came to a screeching halt. The first sign of trouble was a letter from the HOA, and it wasn't a friendly welcome note. It was a warning about cars parked in front of homes. Not just one car or a fleet of them, just any car parked on the street in front of their own home. It was the beginning of a barrage of letters that would follow, each one more ridiculous than the last. It didn't take long for my friend to realize that the HOA was less about managing the retention basin and more about controlling every aspect of the residents' lives. The parking situation was just the tip of the iceberg. The community soon found itself embroiled in a heated debate over something as seemingly innocuous as a flag. One of the residents, proud of their Puerto Rican heritage, decided to display their flag outside their home. That flag became a lightning rod for controversy, sparking a political firestorm within the neighborhood. Sides were taken, voices were raised, and the HOA held an emergency meeting to address the issue. The result? A new rule that only the USA flag and sports team flags were allowed to be flown. The absurdity of it all was laughable, but the impact on the community was anything but. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but think about my parents. Their neighborhood, a sprawling development built in the 80s, had multiple retention basins scattered throughout. Yet in all the years they'd lived there, not once had anyone mentioned the need for an HOA. The basins were maintained by the municipality, funded by the taxes everyone paid. The system worked seamlessly, without any need for oversight by a homeowners association. As I walked through my parents' neighborhood, I noticed something that reinforced my suspicions. The lawns were perfectly manicured, each home looked well kept, and there wasn't a single eyesore in sight. It was the kind of place that could grace the cover of a lifestyle magazine. And yet there was no HOA dictating the shade of their shutters or fining them for leaving their trash cans out a little too long. The neighbors took pride in their homes without the need for someone looking over their shoulders, ready to pounce at the slightest infraction. It was then that the realization hit me. The retention basin excuse was just that, an excuse. It was a lie, a convenient cover for something much more insidious. The HOA wasn't there to manage a patch of grass. It was a tool for control, a way for certain individuals to exert their will over others, all while lining their pockets with kickbacks from contractors and fees from residents. It was a racket, plain and simple. When my wife and I began our house hunt, I had one non-negotiable: no HOA. I'd heard too many horror stories, and the last thing I wanted was to live under the thumb of a power-hungry board. So when we found a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood with no HOA, I didn't hesitate. We put in an offer, and 6 months ago, we moved into our dream home. The relief I felt was immense. There was no one telling me what color to paint my front door, no threats of fines for leaving my trash cans out, and no fear of receiving a letter for parking my car in front of my own house. I could finally breathe easy. But the stories my friend shared with me served as a constant reminder of how lucky I was. His once idyllic neighborhood had become a battleground, with the HOA at the center of every conflict. The board members, who were supposed to represent the community's best interests, seemed more interested in enforcing arbitrary rules and collecting fines than fostering a sense of camaraderie. They reveled in their power, using it to settle personal vendettas and assert their dominance over the residents. It was a toxic environment, and my friend was stuck in the middle of it. The retention basin, the very thing that was supposed to justify the HOA's existence, had become a symbol of the deceit at the heart of the entire operation. It wasn't about managing the land. It was about managing people, stripping them of their autonomy, and dictating every aspect of their lives. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deep the deception ran. As I watched my friend's situation unfold, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and frustration. This wasn't how people should be living. A home is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where you can be yourself without fear of judgment or retribution. But for my friend and his neighbors, their homes had become a source of stress and anxiety. The HOA, which was supposed to protect their interests, had instead become their biggest enemy. It didn't take long for the atmosphere in my friend's neighborhood to change. Once friendly neighbors were now suspicious of one another, afraid that a casual conversation or a friendly wave could be misconstrued and reported to the HOA. The sense of community that had drawn them all to the neighborhood in the first place was eroding before their eyes, replaced by an air of tension and mistrust. The retention basin lie had done more than just bring an unnecessary HOA into their lives. It had robbed them of the very thing that made a neighborhood a community. People were no longer looking out for each other. They were watching each other, waiting for someone to slip up so they could avoid the HOA's wrath. It was a heartbreaking transformation, and it all stemmed from a simple patch of grass. The final straw came when my friend received a letter from the HOA threatening to fine him for a minor violation. It was something so trivial, so utterly ridiculous, that I couldn't believe it when he told me. The letter claimed he had left his garbage cans out for an extra hour past the designated collection time, a minor oversight that most people would consider inconsequential. Yet the HOA had taken it upon themselves to enforce this rule with the same fervor as if it were a serious crime. As he read the letter aloud, I could hear the disbelief in his voice mixed with a growing frustration. It was a stark reminder of the reality he was living in, a reality where the people who were supposed to be his neighbors were instead his adversaries, ready to pounce on the slightest misstep. The sense of community he once cherished had been replaced by a culture of surveillance and punishment, leaving him feeling isolated and targeted in a place he had hoped would be a welcoming home. The decision to buy a home is one of the biggest a person can make, and it should be a joyous occasion. But for my friend, it had become a nightmare, all because of a lie. The retention basin, the HOA, the endless rules and regulations, it was all designed to control, to take away the freedom that comes with owning a home. What should have been a celebration of independence had turned into a constant battle against arbitrary restrictions. The promise of community and shared responsibility had morphed into a suffocating web of bylaws and fines. My friend found himself second-guessing every decision, from the color of his mailbox to the type of flowers in his garden, always fearing the next letter or complaint. The dream of homeownership had been tainted by the reality of living under the thumb of an overzealous HOA, all under the guise of maintaining a retention basin that could have been managed just as effectively by the municipality. As I sit in my own home, free from the grasp of an HOA, I can't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. My heart goes out to those who aren't as fortunate, those who are trapped in neighborhoods where the very people who should be building up the community are instead tearing it apart. The retention basin lie is more than just a lie. It's a trap, one that ensnares unsuspecting homeowners and slowly chips away at their sense of autonomy and peace. It's a warning, one that I'm grateful to have avoided. But for those who weren't so lucky, the fight continues day after day, against an enemy that was never supposed to be there in the first place. The lie part is the word only. Yes, many older communities have infrastructure like retention basins that are owned and operated by the municipality, but the problem is that many municipalities got smart over the years and realized that they could place requirements on new construction to manage and maintain their own subdivision infrastructure. The government of your non-HOA home put that requirement in place for the HOAs around you. They can also burden your home with other problems in the future. Yes, but let's just discard that whole train of thought for a moment, because it is ineffectual and just spirals into griping. So, flood management is logically the purview of government, as an act of God like torrential downpours theoretically affect everyone. By privatizing the design and upkeep of several retention ponds for a neighborhood, you have effectively made your neighbor your keeper. If your neighbor, the HOA, cannot maintain the infrastructure, you will end up with water flooding your house. This spread out over a town or a county is dangerous, as in such a system no one person or entity is absolutely responsible for maintaining the flood prevention infrastructure. This is going to eventually cause problems, as ultimately the HOA is beholden to the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, federal authorities, despite them not having near the resources or ability to raise funds like a division of government. This is not talked about nearly enough, and it needs to be aired out repeatedly if you really are F the HOA. The HOA is a bad venue for dealing with many problems, as it lacks the ability to raise funds to deal with problems, and lacks the leverage to negotiate discounts. The minor annoyances of HOA life are one thing, that you can literally be bankrupted by the poor decision-making of the HOA members next to you is another.
John Glover had lived in Clavenhood for over a decade. He loved his house, his neighborhood, and his friends. He didn't love the homeowners association that governed the community. The HOA was notorious for making up arbitrary and ridiculous rules and enforcing them with hefty fines. John and his fellow residents often felt like they had no say in how they lived in their own homes. One of the most absurd rules that the HOA imposed was that no one could have any visitors for any reason after 10 p.m. and no overnight guests at all. The HOA claimed that this was to maintain the peace and quiet of the neighborhood and to prevent any unwanted incidents. John thought that this was a blatant violation of his privacy and freedom. He wondered how the HOA could even monitor who came and went from his house. He found out the hard way one night when his wife, Lisa, had a severe asthma attack. John panicked and called an ambulance, hoping that they would arrive in time to save her. He didn't think about the HOA rule or the security cameras that were installed on every street corner. He only cared about his wife's life. The ambulance arrived at 1 in the morning, and the paramedics rushed Lisa to the hospital. John followed them in his car, praying that she would be okay. He didn't notice the HOA president, Jules Blackwell, watching from his window with a smug smile on his face. The next day, John received a letter from the HOA informing him that he had violated the visitor rule and that he had to pay a fine of $10,000. John couldn't believe what he was reading. He was furious and outraged. He grabbed the letter and stormed to Jules' house, ready to confront him. He knocked on the door, and Jules opened it. He looked at John with a fake expression of concern. "Hello, John. I heard about your wife. How is she doing?" Jules asked. "None of your business. How dare you fine me for calling an ambulance for her? She could have died." John shouted. John, calm down. You know the rules. No visitors after 10 p.m. It doesn't matter who they are or why they are here. You broke the rule, and you have to pay the price," Jules said. John expressed his frustration, stating, "This isn't governance, it's tyranny. You lack the authority to dictate who I associate with in my own home. Monitoring me and my neighbors is a violation of privacy. Additionally, coercing us into funding your arbitrary regulations is unjust. Frankly, you're the most ineffective HOA president I've encountered, and I refuse to tolerate it any longer." He flung the letter toward Jules' face and barged past him into his house. Glancing around, he noticed Jules lived a life of luxury, surrounded by opulent furniture, artwork, and high-end gadgets. On the desk, he spotted a sizable stack of letters bearing the HOA logo. John inquired, "Is this where you store the fines you collect from us? How much money have you earned from enforcing these rules? And how much of it have you used for your own benefit?" Jules tried to grab the letters, but John was faster. He snatched them and opened them. He was shocked by what he saw. Jules had fined almost every resident of Clavenhood for various reasons, such as having the wrong color of curtains, having a dog that barked too loud, having a lawn that was too long or too short, and many more. The fines ranged from $500 to $20,000, depending on Jules' mood. John realized that Jules was using the HOA as a way to extort money from the residents and to control their lives. "This is unacceptable. This is unlawful. You're acting like a thief and a dictator. I will uncover your corruption and take legal action against you and the HOA. I will work to remove you from power and liberate this neighborhood from your oppressive rule," John declared. He ran out of the house, with the letters in his hand. He went to his neighbors and showed them the evidence. They were all shocked and angry. They agreed with John that they had had enough of Jules and the HOA. They decided to band together and fight back. They hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Jules and the HOA. They accused them of fraud, extortion, harassment, and abuse of power. They demanded that the HOA be dissolved and that Jules be removed from his position. They also demanded that all the fines be refunded and that all the rules be revoked. The lawsuit made the news and attracted the attention of the media and the public. Many people supported John and his neighbors and criticized Jules and the HOA. They praised them for standing up for their rights and for challenging the HOA's authority. The case went to court, and the judge ruled in favor of John and his neighbors. He found Jules and the HOA guilty of all the charges and ordered them to pay a large sum of money to the plaintiffs. He also dissolved the HOA and banned Jules from ever being involved in any HOA again. John and his neighbors rejoiced in their triumph and expressed gratitude toward their lawyer. They felt joyous and relieved knowing they had regained their freedom, allowing them to reside peacefully in their homes. They resolved to establish a fresh HOA with fairer and more democratic regulations. Unanimously, they decided that any future rule must garner the support of at least 75% of the members, and that any member could introduce or contest a rule. They elected John as their new HOA president, and he pledged to govern with fairness and respect for all. Upon returning home, John embraced his wife, who had fully recovered from her asthma attack and remained healthy since. Sharing the good news with her, she beamed and tenderly kissed him. Together, they extended invitations to friends and family for a celebratory gathering. Amidst laughter and joy, everyone relished in the moment, unconcerned about the hour or the volume of the festivities.
Test sucesso, I'm finally ready to purchase my first home. After months of searching, I find a lovely little spot in a nice HOA community that I've heard lots of good things about. The house is nestled in a picturesque neighborhood, surrounded by towering oak trees and well-manicured lawns. The community boasts a beautiful clubhouse, tennis courts, and an indoor pool that caught my eye immediately. As I toured the property, I could already envision myself settling into this idyllic setting. The closing date is coming up soon, supposedly October 3rd, but the process has been moving at a snail's pace. The house hasn't even been appraised yet, which is causing me no small amount of anxiety. Every day that passes without progress feels like an eternity, and I find myself constantly checking my phone for updates from my realtor. The waiting game is taking its toll on my nerves, as I juggle work responsibilities with the endless paperwork and documentation required for the purchase. I've already had to reschedule my moving plans twice, and the uncertainty is making it difficult to give notice at my current rental. To make matters worse, the seller's agent seems to be dragging their feet on providing necessary documents, and my lender keeps requesting additional information at the last minute. The lack of communication from all parties involved is frustrating, leaving me in a state of limbo. I've started having vivid dreams about the house slipping through my fingers, waking up in cold sweats, and immediately reaching for my phone to check for any overnight updates. The stress of this drawn-out process is beginning to affect my daily life, making it hard to concentrate at work and enjoy my free time. Just recently, though, I've learned some troubling information that's casting a shadow over my dream home. A fiber internet company is ready to install high-speed internet into the community, but the HOA is trying to skim off the top. This revelation has sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, with residents divided and tensions running high. The fiber company's proposal promises to revolutionize internet access in our rural area, offering speeds that would make working from home and online education a breeze. However, the HOA's attempt to profit from this essential service has sparked outrage among many residents. Some homeowners are organizing petitions and planning to confront the HOA board at the next meeting, while others are reluctantly siding with the HOA, fearing that challenging their authority might lead to other issues down the line. The once quiet community Facebook group has turned into a battleground of heated debates and accusations, with neighbors taking sides and friendships being strained over the issue. The community is located in a very rural area where internet options are severely limited. Currently, residents are forced to rely on satellite internet that costs a staggering $200 a month for a measly 7 megabits per second download speed. It's like stepping back in time to the early 2000s, with painfully slow connections that are about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. The exorbitant cost only adds insult to injury. Despite its internet woes, the community itself is filled with wealthy families and summer vacation homes. The streets are lined with luxurious cars, and perfectly landscaped gardens surround each property. It's a stark contrast to the digital dark age the residents are living in. Strolling through the neighborhood, one can't help but marvel at the opulence on display. Sprawling mansions with manicured lawns and intricate water features dot the landscape. High-end SUVs and sports cars gleam in circular driveways, while professional landscaping crews meticulously trim hedges and tend to vibrant flower beds. The community clubhouse boasts a state-of-the-art gym and an Olympic-sized pool, further emphasizing the affluence of the area. Yet, behind the facades of these impressive homes, residents struggle with glacially slow internet speeds, unable to fully enjoy the modern amenities their wealth should afford them. The irony is palpable as million-dollar homes are equipped with cutting-edge smart home technology that can barely function due to the inadequate internet infrastructure. In the new age of COVID-19, with so much schooling being done from home, the community has been grappling with serious issues due to the subpar internet. Children struggle to attend online classes, their faces freezing mid-sentence during Zoom calls. Parents working remotely find themselves unable to join important video conferences, potentially jeopardizing their careers. The frustration is overwhelming, with many residents at their wits' end, if this works. Apparently, the community has been fighting tooth and nail to convince the HOA to allow the fiber lines to be installed. They've cited the desperate need for reliable internet for school and work, but the HOA seems to have turned a deaf ear to their pleas. The board members, poised in their ivory towers, appear more concerned with lining their pockets than addressing the needs of the community they're supposed to serve. As I delve deeper into this issue, I discover that the HOA's resistance to the fiber installation goes beyond mere greed. There are whispers of backdoor deals with the current satellite internet provider, allegations of kickbacks, and rumors of personal vendettas against the fiber company. The plot thickens with each new piece of information I uncover. The situation has created a rift in the community. On one side, you have the tech-savvy residents and young families who are desperate for better internet. They've formed a grassroots movement, complete with social media campaigns and yard signs advocating for fiber installation. On the other side, you have the old guard, longtime residents who fear change and are content with the status quo, no matter how outdated it may be. What's most baffling is that these people are so short-sighted they don't realize they don't need to skim off the top. The terrible internet is the only downside to this otherwise perfect community. Installing fiber would instantly skyrocket the value of the properties, benefiting everyone in the long run. It's like they're sitting on a gold mine but refusing to dig because they're afraid of getting their hands dirty. As I contemplate my potential future in this community, I find myself torn. The house itself is everything I've dreamed of, spacious, modern, with a beautiful view of the surrounding countryside. But the prospect of dealing with Stone Age internet and a stubborn HOA gives me pause. I begin to wonder if there's anything I can do if I buy this house to try to annoy someone or make my voice heard to get fiber allowed. I start researching HOA bylaws and regulations, looking for any loophole or leverage I can use. Do HOAs have meetings I can attend or a board I can run for? Is there someone in charge I can constantly call, email, or show up to complain to? The more I dig, the more complex the situation becomes. I uncover a web of local politics, long-standing feuds, and conflicting interests that make my head spin. As the closing date approaches, I find myself at a crossroads. Do I walk away from my dream home because of this internet debacle, or do I dive in headfirst, ready to fight the good fight for better connectivity? The decision weighs heavily on me, keeping me up at night as I weigh the pros and cons. I decide to reach out to some of the current residents to get their perspective. I connect with Julie, a young mother of two who's been leading the charge for fiber installation. She shares horror stories of her children missing crucial online exams due to internet outages and her husband nearly losing a major client because he couldn't join a video call. Her passion and determination are infectious, and I find myself drawn into the cause. On the flip side, I also speak with George, an elderly gentleman who's lived in the community for decades. He scoffs at the need for high-speed internet, insisting that if dial-up was good enough back in my day, it's good enough now. His resistance to change is frustrating, but it gives me insight into the mindset I'll be up against if I decide to join this community. As I mull over my options, I receive an unexpected call from my realtor. The appraisal has finally come through, and the house has been valued even higher than the asking price. It's a sign, I think to myself. Maybe this is meant to be. I decide to take the plunge and move forward with the purchase. But I'm not going in naively. I'm arming myself with knowledge about HOA regulations, networking with like-minded residents, and preparing for a battle to bring this community into the 21st century. The closing day arrives, and as I sign the mountain of paperwork, I feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. I'm not just buying a house. I'm stepping into a community in turmoil, ready to make my voice heard. As I'm handed the keys to my new home, I can't help but feel that I'm also being handed a mission: to fight for progress and drag this HOA kicking and screaming into the digital age. As I unlock the door to my new home for the first time, I take a deep breath. The house is perfect, but the battle for better internet looms large. I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready for the challenge. After all, in today's world, the right to high-speed internet is worth fighting for. And fight I will, armed with determination, facts, and a vision for a better connected community. Kind of a few inaccuracies there. Since Dodd-Frank became law, appraisals are not run by banks. There is an intermediary called an AMC, Appraisal Management Company. The borrower pays their bank for an appraisal, and the bank tells the AMC that an appraisal needs done on the property. The AMC puts out the order and appraisers will bid on it. In regards to trying to appraise for the purchase price, that's usually what happens unless there is some crazy shit going on. There's going to be comparable homes in the area that sold for similar amounts, so it's usually easy to get the purchase to match up. The only time an appraiser is going to come under purchase price is if there's a huge difference in value. Like if you buy a 4-bedroom, 3-bath, 2,300 square foot house for $500,000, and a similar house down the road sold for $400K 3 months ago, there's very little that can cause that much of a jump. The bank's definitely going to reject that sale. Usually you wouldn't be this far in a contract and still have a contingency that allows you out based on due diligence, finding out about the internet. It's not even remotely weird that your appraisal isn't back yet. That's the last piece of the puzzle, usually comes back days before closing. Unless it appraises low, you're probably not getting out without losing your earnest money. But people seem to forget that it's more than just losing your earnest money. The seller could sue for damages if you don't back out on a contingency. It is a legally binding contract, not an arbitrary piece of paper. Crazy story. So in my little HOA not that long ago, an ISP wanted to lay down fiber. The HOA fought tooth and nail, which is retarded by the way, and even petitioned the city, filed an injunction. The whole 9 yards. They eventually lost because the community was designed with easements for gas, water, and you guessed it, fiber. It was all part of the master plan of the developer, but it just took until enough homes were built for the company to incur the expense of boring the neighborhood. Long story short, local court ruled in the favor of the ISP, and the HOA had to pay their court costs. Moral of the story, it's likely the same. Your HOA, like all, is run by a hybrid beast I refer to as a boomer Karen. They are power-hungry vultures, evil, and literally the worst people to walk the planet. I never thought I'd be caught up in such a mess when I moved into this condo community last year. It was supposed to be a peaceful place to settle down, but boy, was I wrong. Let me tell you about the absolute chaos that's been unfolding here since February. So, we got this new HOA board, right? A bunch of newbies who hadn't even lived here for a year. They somehow got appointed and took over, and let me tell you, they've been nothing but trouble from day one. It's like they're on a mission to destroy everything good about this place residents have called home for 42 years. At first, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just needed some time to adjust, But nope, they went full steam ahead with their crazy ideas. It started small, but before we knew it, they were tearing apart the very fabric of our community. One of the first things they did was start enforcing rules like they were on some power trip. But here's the kicker, they only seemed to target certain owners. It was like they had a personal vendetta against some folks. I saw my neighbor, old Mrs. Johnson, get a warning for having a potted plant on her porch. Meanwhile, the board president's buddy had a whole jungle growing on his balcony, and not a peep from them. Then came the towing incident. I'll never forget waking up one morning to find half the parking lot empty. They'd towed a bunch of cars overnight, giving people less than a day's notice. Can you believe that? People were scrambling, trying to figure out where their cars had gone. It was chaos, but that was just the beginning. They started coming up with all these new rules and regulations that made no sense. Half of them went against our existing CCRs and bylaws, not to mention state laws. It's like they didn't even bother to read the existing documents before making up their own rules. And don't get me started on the finances. These yahoos drained our reserve account faster than you can say mismanagement. They decided to do all this maintenance work that should have been planned out over years, not months. Now we're broke, and the place looks worse than ever. The pool fiasco was the last straw for a lot of us. They hired some fly-by-night company to do work on our pool. 2 days later, the pool was completely destroyed. I mean, it looked like a bomb went off in there. Now it's closed for this year, probably next year too, and we're likely headed to court over it. Great job, guys. But the worst part, the bullying. I've seen board members having full-on temper tantrums in the parking lot, screaming at owners and vendors alike. It's embarrassing, really. And they can't seem to keep any vendors around. They've fired every single one they've hired, and not a single job has been completed. Oh, and here's a real kicker. They've started denying repairs to common property, claiming it's not the HOA's responsibility. They're telling owners to fix things themselves. Last week, my upstairs neighbor had a leak coming from the roof, and the board told her to climb up there and fix it herself. Can you imagine? It's been a nightmare, honestly. 5 months of constant stress and drama. We're all at our wits' end. Some of us started talking about organizing a meeting to discuss these issues, try to come up with a plan to present to the board. But somehow they got wind of it. Next thing we know, they're throwing this big movie night. Bought a projector, speakers, even got some recreational equipment and refreshments. I guess they thought they could win us over with popcorn and a cheesy movie. Well, let me tell you how that went down. 6 people showed up. 6, and 4 of them were board members themselves. The other 2, a former board member and their friend. It was almost funny if it wasn't so sad. The rest of us, we stayed home. Sent a clear message that we're not buying what they're selling. I hope they got the hint, but knowing them, they probably didn't. Instead of taking a step back and reconsidering their approach, they knee-jerked and scheduled a community meeting for next week. I'm not holding my breath for any real change, but who knows? I've been here less than a year and I'm already thinking about moving. It's a shame, really. This used to be such a nice place to live. Now it feels like we're living under the rule of some petty dictators who don't know the first thing about running an HOA. I'm hoping that the community meeting might be a turning point. Maybe if enough of us show up and voice our concerns, they'll finally listen. But part of me worries it'll just be another opportunity for them to bulldoze over us, with more ridiculous rules and decisions. For now, I'm just trying to keep my head down and stay out of their crosshairs. I've seen what happens to people who speak up, and it's not pretty. But I can't help feeling like something's got to give soon. This can't go on forever, right? I never thought I'd say this, but I actually miss our old, boring HOA board. At least they knew how to keep the lights on and the grass cut without starting a civil war. These new folks, they're like a tornado that's ripped through our community, leaving nothing but chaos in their wake. So here we are, stuck in this mess, wondering how long it'll take before something finally changes. Will the movie night flop be the wake-up call they need? Will the community meeting actually lead to some positive changes? Or are we in for more months of this insanity? I guess only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, I'll never take a quiet, well-run HOA for granted again. Who knew that a bunch of newbies with a little bit of power could cause so much havoc? It's been a wild ride, and something tells me we're not at the end of it yet. Here's hoping for a miracle, or at least a board that knows how to read a budget and follow basic laws. Is that really too much to ask? It shouldn't have to be like that, though. It's horse crap. A small little get-together of chicken crap tyrants shouldn't be able to impose their garbage ideas on the property and livelihoods of other people just because those other people don't want to play their stupid games. People already deal with the government breathing down their necks. They shouldn't have to put up with some holier-than-thou suck-up-a-holes and their fake rules. What did they do exactly? The projector equipment was probably within their spend limit. It takes time to build an audience for these kind of events. Calling a meeting when you hear people are upset is exactly what a good board does. They are saying that they want to hear what issues owners are having. You aren't presenting any dire events. I live on a modest plot of land that sits right beside, but not within, one of those small developments that prides itself on having a homeowners association, HOA. Now the HOA and my land are separated by a flimsy line of scrub trees and overgrown bushes, almost as if Mother Nature was trying to give us both a buffer. On one side of that line were the families who willingly subjected themselves to the HOA's rules and regulations. And on my side, well, we liked our freedom, thank you very much. A few years ago, during the height of a strange time in the world, some folks in the development decided to throw a Halloween bash. The lockdowns had been easing, and people were itching to get out and feel human again. It wasn't an HOA-exclusive event, thank goodness, because I wouldn't have stepped foot there if it had been. Everyone in the surrounding properties, including us non-HOA types, was invited to join in the festivities. My wife, who's always had a bit of a soft spot for neighborly goodwill, had volunteered to help set up for the party. Naturally, I found myself roped into the whole thing too. We hauled over some folding chairs, a few tables, and a couple of dishes my wife insisted we make. The kids, of course, couldn't care less about the logistics. The minute we arrived, they bolted toward the other children, vanishing into the frenzy of costumes, games, and whatever mischievous plots young minds could conjure. With the tables set and the food ready to go, I had a rare moment of stillness. It wasn't long, though, before I spotted the other adults beginning to mill around, trying to meet one another. I figured, why not? I'm no social butterfly, but I can hold my own in small talk. I was scanning the crowd when a man sauntered up to me, his chest puffed out like some kind of cartoon character who thought he owned the place. "Hi," I said, extending my hand in a friendly gesture. The man didn't take it. Instead, he stood there, arms crossed, looking like he had something important to declare. I assumed he was just shy, but then he opened his mouth, and the words that came out were, well, ridiculous. "Treasurer," he said, "that's it. Just treasurer. No name, no friendly introduction, just his HOA title, as though it were some kind of rank he had earned in a grand battle." I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "What?" I asked, genuinely unsure if I had heard him correctly. "I'm treasurer," he repeated, as if this was all the clarification I needed. "Okay," I said slowly, trying to wrap my head around the situation. This guy wasn't even going to bother with pleasantries like sharing his actual name. He had introduced himself as his HOA title, as if I was supposed to be impressed. He clearly wasn't deterred by my confusion. In fact, he puffed up even more, like a balloon someone had blown into one too many times. "I'm the one you have to get to sign off on any improvements you want to make to your property." Now, up until this moment, I had forgotten all about the HOA lurking next door. They were no more relevant to my life than the squirrels darting through the trees between our properties. When I bought my house, I'd made it abundantly clear to my real estate agent that HOA was a four-letter word in my book. I'd dealt with one in the past, and I had no interest in being entangled in another. So, hearing this man proudly proclaim his authority over my property was not just unexpected, it was downright infuriating. But I kept calm. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd annoyed me. Instead, I gave him a deadpan look and said, "Nah, I don't have to worry about that." The treasurer, however, seemed to think I was mistaken. He narrowed his eyes and leaned in, as if to make sure I understood the gravity of his words. "Oh, you absolutely do," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You had to sign legally binding documents when you bought your house, just like everyone else here." I couldn't help but smirk. This poor guy really had no idea. He thought I was one of his subjects, a fellow HOA member who had willingly shackled themselves to the rulebook. I pointed over to the thin line of trees that separated our properties and said, "You see those trees? My house is on the other side of them." The look on his face was priceless. It was as if someone had yanked the rug out from under him, and he hadn't been prepared for the fall. His puffed-up chest deflated almost instantly. His smug grin vanishing like a popped balloon, he stared at me for a moment, dumbfounded, before the realization sank in. I wasn't one of his. I didn't live on his turf, and he had absolutely no power over me. The best part, I didn't even need to say anything more. The defeat was written all over his face. He turned on his heel and stormed away, probably wishing the ground would open up and swallow him whole. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Maybe that makes me petty, but in that moment, I didn't care. There was something deeply gratifying about knocking that HOA crown off his head, metaphorically speaking. From that point on, the treasurer avoided me like the plague. He didn't make eye contact, didn't acknowledge my existence for the rest of the party, and honestly, that was exactly what I wanted. Let him go back to his HOA meetings and pretend he was in charge of something that mattered. I was perfectly content to enjoy my freedom from his ridiculous power trip. As the night wore on, I settled into a chair with a drink in hand, watching as the kids darted between the trees, giggling and chasing each other. My wife was mingling with the other neighbors, but I didn't feel the need to join in. I was content to sit back and reflect on what had just transpired. Moments like these, when you get to remind people that they don't have nearly as much control as they think they do, were rare. And boy, was this one sweet. Toward the end of the night, I saw Treasurer skulking around the edges of the party, his shoulders slumped. I could tell he wasn't enjoying himself. Maybe the realization that he didn't have dominion over everyone had dampened his spirits. Or maybe he was just waiting for the next opportunity to assert his so-called authority over some poor soul who didn't live on the other side of the trees. Either way, I didn't care. My interaction with him was done, and that was the end of it. When it was time to pack up and head home, I gathered the kids and loaded up the car with the folding chairs and tables we had brought. My wife said her goodbyes to the neighbors, and as we made our way back to our side of the tree line, I couldn't help but glance back at the development. The lights were still on, and the party was winding down, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be losing any sleep over whatever nonsense the HOA had going on over there. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a calm wash over me. I didn't have to worry about Treasurer or any of his rules. My home, my land, my life, all blissfully free from the clutches of his HOA, and in that golden moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. No HOA would ever have power over me again. Dude, you should have kept going for as long as you could. Hit him with a, but you didn't sign off on my new shed I built, and I painted my house last week. Did I need to have you sign off on the color? I only worked on my broken down truck 5 days of the week. That's not a problem, right? Do I need to halt my porch being built today too? Make this dude have a stroke with the amount of stress laughing my ass off. He's like a guy that first know that claims a special corner seat at a bar that I only went into once. I sat there before he came in. People warned me about him. Eventually, he wanders in, sits next to me, and gives a look like I sat on his parrot on the seat I was in. He looked crushed. He said he normally sits there. I said I'm drinking my beers. I had another beer, but I can see he was really getting anxious. I eventually finished my beer and no longer felt like I'd want to be there any longer with such small world politics. So before I left, I said to him, I guess you're the king of this bar seat. You can run your little world. I'm out of here. Paid and left. The bartender asked why I was leaving so fast. I just said that the dude drives customers away, he's all yours, and walked out. I've seen a few random cases with farmland HOAs like this where there is a one-person developer who also has a seat on the board, and the CC&Rs are written so that the developer has full architectural control, e.g. the lots are not all sold yet. So they actually have their powers as the developer, not as the HOA, even if they might also have a seat on the HOA board. A benevolent tyrant, with or without an HOA like that, can be useful, as truly bad neighbors abound in these farmland subdivisions. I'm not talking don't cut their lawn weekly, or work on cars in the driveway, bad neighbors. I'm talking fence off their neighbor's property and build a machine shed on it with a new driveway, or trench a drain into the neighbor's septic system and tap their irrigation off the neighbor's water service line, bad neighbors. Alright, let me tell you about this wild HOA situation I found myself in. It's been a real headache, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around how things got so out of hand. So here's the deal. My wife and I moved into this new neighborhood about a year ago. It's one of those places where they're still building houses left and right. You know the type. Construction noise all day, trucks coming and going, and that constant feeling of living in a work in progress. When we bought our house, we didn't have much choice in the HOA matter. The builder had already set one up, and it was part of the contract. We figured, hey, how bad could it be? Well, turns out pretty bad. From day one, we noticed things weren't quite right. The neighborhood had issues that needed addressing, but every time we reached out to the HOA, it was like shouting into a void. No responses, no action, nothing. It was frustrating, to say the least. After months of getting nowhere, we finally managed to get the HOA president to agree to a meeting. I remember the day clearly. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and we'd set up in the community center. There were about 20 of us homeowners there, all ready to voice our concerns. The HOA president, let's call him Mr. Johnson, strolled in 15 minutes late. He was a tall guy, probably in his 50s, with a permanent scowl etched on his face. The moment he walked in, the room went quiet. You could feel the tension in the air. Mr. Johnson took his place at the front of the room and started off with, "I want you all to know that I never do this for anyone. You're lucky I'm even here. Don't expect it to happen again. I am the CEO and my time is valuable." I exchanged glances with my wife. This wasn't off to a great start. One of our neighbors, Tom, raised his hand. "Mr. Johnson, we appreciate you coming. We have some concerns we'd like to discuss." Mr. Johnson nodded curtly. "Go ahead, but make it quick. I have other appointments." Tom cleared his throat. "Well, first off, we're worried about the speeding on Main Street. There are no speed limit signs, and with all the kids in the neighborhood, it's becoming dangerous. Is there any way we could get some signs put up?" Mr. Johnson sighed heavily, as if we'd asked him to move mountains. "Speed signs cost money. We'll look into it." I decided to chime in. "There's also the matter of the fountain in the Central Park. It was fixed a while back, but it's broken again. Any chance of getting that repaired?" Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Maintenance issues happen. We'll add it to the list." So far his responses had been terse, but not outright hostile. That was about to change. Mrs. Rodriguez, a sweet lady in her 70s who lived down the street from us, raised her hand next. "Mr. Johnson, I'm concerned about the playground near the pond. The equipment is rusting, and the rust is leaking into the water. We have a lot of wildlife that uses that pond, not to mention our children play there. Could we get someone to look at it?" That's when Mr. Johnson's demeanor shifted. His face turned red, and he leaned forward, pointing a finger at Mrs. Rodriguez. "You people are unbelievable. Do you know how lucky you are to even have a park? Most neighborhoods don't get anything like that." The room fell silent. We were all shocked by his sudden outburst. Mrs. Rodriguez, bless her heart, didn't back down. "Mr. Johnson, I understand we're fortunate to have the park. But if it's unsafe, it needs to be addressed. If it's not fixed, I'm afraid we'll have to report it to the proper authorities. We can't risk harm to the wildlife or our children." That's when all hell broke loose. Mr. Johnson shot up from his chair, his face now a deep shade of purple. "Report it? Who do you think you are, you ungrateful old bat?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stood up, trying to defuse the situation. "Mr. Johnson, please, there's no need for name-calling. We're just trying to address some concerns." He turned his glare on me. "Sit down. You don't get to tell me how to run this HOA. None of you do." Mrs. Rodriguez's son, who had come with her to the meeting, stood up next. He was a big guy, probably in his 40s. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to have to ask you to apologize to my mother and calm down." Mr. Johnson laughed. A harsh, mocking sound. "Or what? You want to take this outside? I'll show you and your mother what you deserve." The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting. Some were trying to calm things down, others were egging on the confrontation. I couldn't believe this was happening at an HOA meeting of all places. Mrs. Rodriguez's son took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Are you threatening a 70-year-old woman and her son? Is that really how you want this to go?" I jumped between them, holding my hands up. "Guys, come on, this isn't solving anything." "Let's all take a breath," and Mr. Johnson shoved me aside. "Get out of my way. I'm done with this circus. You want to know where your money's going? Too bad. You have no say in it. And those emails you keep sending, they're going straight to the trash from now on." He stormed towards the door, pausing only to turn and shout, "Meeting adjourned," before slamming it behind him. We all stood there, stunned into silence. Had that really just happened? Did the president of our HOA really just threaten to fight an elderly woman and her son? As the shock wore off, the room filled with angry voices. Some people were talking about legal action, others about trying to dissolve the HOA entirely. Mrs. Rodriguez was being comforted by her son and several neighbors. I found my wife in the crowd and pulled her aside. "Can you believe what just happened?" She shook her head, still looking stunned. "I knew it was bad, but I never imagined it was this bad. What are we going to do?" That was the million-dollar question. What could we do? According to our contracts, we were stuck with this HOA until every house in the development was sold. And who knew how long that would take? Over the next few days, the neighborhood was buzzing with talk of the disastrous meeting. Some people were fired up, ready to fight. Others were dejected, feeling helpless against the tyranny of Mr. Johnson and his HOA. We tried reaching out to the builder, hoping they might intervene, but we got nothing but automated responses and vague promises to look into the matter. A week after the meeting, I was out mowing my lawn when I saw Mr. Johnson drive by in his fancy sports car. He slowed down as he passed my house, giving me a look that could curdle milk. I just waved, trying to keep things civil despite everything. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Mr. Johnson had no intention of addressing any of our concerns. The speeding on Main Street continued unabated. The fountain remained broken, now just a sad, dry centerpiece in our community park. And the rusty playground, well, let's just say I wouldn't let my kids anywhere near it. Some of the more proactive neighbors started looking into our legal options. Could we sue the HOA, force them to actually do their job? The problem was, most of us were already stretched thin just paying our mortgages and the hefty HOA fees. A legal battle seemed out of reach. Meanwhile, the tension in the neighborhood was tangible. Every time an HOA vehicle drove through, people would stop and stare, wondering what new decree or restriction was coming our way. It felt like living under a microscope, always worried about getting a citation for grass that was a quarter-inch too tall or a mailbox that wasn't the exact shade of beige specified in the bylaws. About a month after the infamous meeting, I ran into Mrs. Rodriguez at the local grocery store. She looked tired, but there was still a fire in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" I asked her as we perused the produce section. She sighed, picking up a tomato and examining it closely. "Oh, still fighting the good fight. My son wants me to move, says this stress isn't good for me at my age. But this is my home, and I'm not going to let some bully chase me out of it." I nodded, admiring her resilience. "Have you heard anything about the playground?" She shook her head. "Not a peep. I've been taking pictures every day, documenting the rust. If they won't listen to us, maybe they'll listen to the EPA or whoever handles these things." As we chatted, I couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and frustration. Here was this woman, in her 70s, having to fight tooth and nail just to get a safe place for her grandkids to play. It wasn't right. The following weekend, a group of us decided to take matters into our own hands, at least as far as the speeding issue was concerned. We pooled our money and bought some of those slow-down signs you see in neighborhoods with kids. It wasn't much, but it was something. We were out putting up the signs when an HOA truck came screeching around the corner. Mr. Johnson himself jumped out, looking like he was about to burst a blood vessel. "What do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, marching towards us. I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're just putting up some safety signs, Mr. Johnson. Since the HOA wouldn't do it, we thought." "You thought wrong," he interrupted, ripping one of the signs out of the ground. "This is HOA property. You can't just do whatever you want." "But it's for the safety of our kids," one of the other neighbors, Mike, chimed in. "Surely you can see that's important?" Mr. Johnson turned his glare on Mike. "What I see is a bunch of troublemakers who don't know their place. Take these signs down immediately, or I'll have you all fined for violating HOA regulations." We stood our ground, a tense standoff in the middle of the street. Cars were starting to slow down, people rubbernecking to see what was going on. "Mr. Johnson," I said, trying one last time to reason with him, "we're not trying to cause trouble. We just want our neighborhood to be safe and well-maintained. Isn't that what the HOA is supposed to be for?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, doubt, shame in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual scowl. "The HOA is here to maintain property values and enforce the rules," he said coldly. "If you don't like it, you're free to move." With that, he got back in his truck and drove off, leaving us standing there with our signs and our frustration. As we reluctantly took down the signs, I couldn't help but wonder how things had gotten to this point. How had our dream of living in a nice, family-friendly neighborhood turned into this nightmare of petty tyranny and neglect? I looked around at my neighbors, good people who just wanted a safe, pleasant place to live, and felt a renewed determination. This wasn't over. Somehow, someway, we were going to make things right. We had to. Because this wasn't just about broken fountains or rusty playgrounds anymore. It was about standing up for our community, for our homes, for our right to have a say in how we live. As I walked back to my house, sign in hand, I knew one thing for certain. The battle with Mr. Johnson and his iron-fisted HOA was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. You were likely dealing with the developer representative. While your community is under developer control, the residents have no say-so in the matter. The funds needed to support the community are paid by your builder. Eventually, the residents will have a board of directors made of community volunteers. For now, you have to embrace the suck. You don't have an HOA or an HOA, CEO, those don't exist. What you have is a builder-developer whose only motivation is to sell the rest of the houses and move on. I hate to break this to you, but they don't care what you want. They have zero motivation to listen to or deal with you. What they want and what they'll do is anything they think will help them sell the rest of the houses, make their money, and move on to their next money-making development. You want my advice? Don't give yourself the headache. You likely won't get anywhere with the developer. You might need to wait until the developer leaves and an actual HOA is formed that's controlled by the neighbors. They have a motivation to listen and are vested in the neighborhood. The only way the developer will care is if it somehow impacts their bottom line. FYI, for future. Once the builder hands over the HOA to the actual homeowners in a normal functioning HOA, the homeowners elect the board. The board makes the decisions and sets the direction. They then hire a third-party management company to enforce what the board wants. At any point, the board can fire the management company. This is what had to do. And also, if the homeowners are not satisfied with the direction the board is going, they can vote them out as well. Ultimate power always lies with the homeowners. Problem is, too many are apathetic or don't understand how this works.
I'll start this off by saying my ex is vindictive as hell.
We've been fully divorced since about right before the pandemic started. We sold the house we shared, and I didn't have to pay her alimony because she cheated and we're in an at-fault state.
It was messy since D-Day.
All of the stereotypes. First the sobbing and then trickled truths saying, "I love you." It was just one time. Okay, it was 2 years. And then the gaslighting followed by, "I'm going to take you for everything," before packing her shit and walking out. I feel like I never really knew the woman my ex was in all the time we were together.
We were married 5 years and together for 7. And in 2 of those 5 married years, she had affairs with 3 other men.
The final one being a foreign businessman of some sort from what I could find out. Yes, I got tested for STDs and was thankfully negative.
Yes, she got pregnant by the final AP. And no, I didn't sign the birth certificate because I found out about the all affairs before the baby was born, thanks to a call from the first AP.
My ex tried to go full scorched earth on me.
But since we live in and were married in an at-fault state, she lost. We didn't pay equally into our house, and the equity was divided 70-30.
So I got a pretty good cash payout when I sold our marital home to put as a down payment on a different house, closer to my job. It's a bit of a downgrade.
But suits a single guy in his 30s like me just fine.
My ex did show up to my house once.
But I refused to let her in. She bitched at me that I'd financially ruined her in the divorce. I said that if she was fully willing to do that to me first, and the bitch had the audacity to say it should have been my life, FKD, over and not hers. I laughed so hard and said it was karma. She yelled that she'd sue me for what was rightfully hers.
I said if she was going to sue me, then to go ahead and sue me.
It'd end up the same way in court because she has nothing but a false sob story. She was the cheater, not me. I'm no angels that I didn't do anything to her.
And she was the one who ruined our marriage.
She then said she'd tell everyone she could that I abused her. I said I'd sue her for defamation if she did, and I was recording our interaction and had those words saved to my phone.
She went wide-eyed and her jaw dropped.
The look people are calling the surprised Pikachu face.
Then I asked why she was there, if not to just try and make trouble. Because she had a new man in her life that knocked her up.
She just huffed at me and said he isn't around much, and she's stuck in a tiny apartment living off his child support till he comes back.
It was immature of me, I know, but I did the bit of playing the world's smallest violin. She yelled at me to go F myself, and I yelled back that I'd sooner do that than her any time. She raged at me and then got in her car to leave.
Haven't seen her since. There is an HOA in my neighborhood. But I was not legally obligated to join it because the last owner of my house was not a member.
I made sure of that through a real estate lawyer as well.
The HOA had no grounds to force me to join, and were not happy about it.
The HOA president would show up with forms every week for the first month, demanding I sign them.
Then she threatened to take me to court.
To which I had to get a C&D sent to her from my lawyer to make her stop that.
So she started harassing me by looking for any infractions she possibly could to report to the city. An inspector came out several times and found nothing wrong. In fact, I offered one of them a burger while grilling, and they graciously accepted. Did I mention the HOA hates barbecues and parties that aren't approved in advance? Well, they do.
And I like to grill when the weather is good. And my neighbors actually love me for it because I invite them over. I had the police called on me several times for noise complaints because I was playing music on a Saturday afternoon while having my friends over. The HOA president I caught trespassing once when she was trying to peer into my windows.
I called the police, but she denied ever doing it.
So I got cameras.
She hasn't trespassed since.
But I still got repeated passive-aggressive letters saying my cameras were not an approved addition to my house.
Some months ago, I started getting letters for fines in the mail. And when I contacted the HOA, their representative claimed they had it on record that I'd joined and needed to pay all fees effective immediately. I told them that was not possible. Then they emailed a scanned copy of the forms, and they had a signature on them. But it was not mine. It was very similar in some ways, and I recognized right away as being my ex's handwriting. She knew what my signature looked like.
But it was a loose imitation at best. I got in touch with a lawyer right away over the forged signature.
But the HOA still demanded to go to court. And it took 7 months before that happened. Meanwhile, they were stacking unpaid fines against me weekly and were threatening to put a lien on my house.
We went to court, and the HOA president looked very smug. But my lawyer pointed out the signature wasn't the same as mine and was very inconsistent in the various forms.
I'd never allowed the HOA president in my house, and I'd never requested the forms. The idiot HOA president actually slammed her palm on the table and said it was still binding. But when pressed where the fraudulent signature came from, she admitted my ex-wife called the HOA, and they sent her the forms, then got them back in the mail signed.
But then she actually claimed she'd thought I'd signed them.
The judge looked at her and asked if she was serious. She confirmed she was. The judge then asked how a woman I was no longer married to, that had never even lived with me in my current residence, was supposed to have any bearing on whether or not I joined her. She went quiet, and I could see the "oh shit" look on her face as the hamster wheels were turning, and she seemed to finally mentally put the pieces together.
My lawyer then counterclaimed that what the HOA did was blatant fraud and legal actions must be taken.
And they were.
I countersued the HOA for the emotional distress of the harassment I'd gotten since moving in, which I had lots of proof of.
That won me about 10 grand after lawyer fees that I decided to put towards my mortgage. The HOA president was removed from her throne.
I like to think she was kicking and screaming.
She was also slapped with a hefty fine.
I've seen her outside a few times, and she always looks at me like I am the devil.
The HOA itself had to pay all of my legal fees too.
I wanted to go after my ex for forging my signature.
But can't, because not long after she forged my signature on those forms, she apparently left the country to be with her third AP.
She's somewhere in Europe from what I can see of the final posts on her FB before she disappeared. So I can't do anything against her unless she ever returns to the US.
So that was a wash.
I'm not getting letters from the HOA anymore though.
And the new president has promised to keep things completely cordial from now on. I still don't feel like I got much of a win in this though.
Other than the $10,000 payout, it all felt like a huge waste of time.
Alright, so here's the deal. I'm gonna tell you about this whole mess with our HOA. It's been driving me up the wall, and I just need to get it off my chest. Buckle up, because this is gonna be a long one. So, we moved into this townhouse a while back. It's on the north side of town, and when we first got here, the place looked amazing. I mean, seriously, it was like something out of a magazine. The landscaping was perfect, everything was neat and tidy, and we thought we'd hit the jackpot with this neighborhood. Fast forward to now, and boy, have things changed. It all started around Christmas time. My wife and I, we like to get into the holiday spirit, you know. So we put up some decorations. Nothing crazy, just some lights and a wreath, that kind of thing. Well, you'd think we'd committed some kind of crime the way the HOA reacted. They came down on us like a ton of bricks, complaining about our decorations. At first, we were like, okay, fine, maybe they have some rules about this stuff. We didn't want to cause trouble, so we took them down. But then things started to get ridiculous. See, our townhouse is in a pretty dark area. There aren't any street lights, and it gets bitch black at night. My wife, being the smart cookie she is, decided to put up some lights around our front door, just so we could see where we were going, you know, basic safety stuff. Well, you wouldn't believe the fuss the HOA kicked up about that. They acted like we were trying to turn our house into Times Square or something. It was just a few lights, for crying out loud. But no, apparently that was too much for them to handle. Then there was the trash can incident. One day, we get this angry call from the HOA. They're yelling at us, and I mean actually yelling, about how our trash cans were left out too long. Now, I'm a reasonable guy. If we'd messed up, I'd own up to it. So I went out to check. Guess what? The trash cans they were losing their minds over weren't even ours. They belonged to someone down the street. Can you believe that? They didn't even bother to check before going off on us. It's like they just assume we're always doing something wrong. But here's where it really gets under my skin. Today, I decided to walk around to the front of our place instead of going in through the garage like we usually do. And let me tell you, what I saw made my jaw drop. The landscaping, which was so beautiful when we moved in, looks like a disaster zone now. Most of the mulch has blown away, leaving bare patches everywhere. The trees, man, it's sad to see. They're all bent over or broken. It looks like no one's taken care of them in months. And get this, they've planted all these non-native plants all over the place. Half of them are dead already. It's like they didn't even think about whether these plants would survive in our climate. The ones that are still alive look sickly and sad. The worst part, those weed blocker sheets they put under the mulch, they're all torn up and scattered all over the sidewalks. It looks like a tornado hit the place. I'm honestly embarrassed to have people over. What must our visitors think when they see this mess? It just burns me up, you know. Here they are, nitpicking every little thing we do. But they can't even keep the neighborhood looking decent. It's like they've completely forgotten their actual job. I wanted to take some pictures to show people how bad it's gotten, but apparently that's against the rules too. Of course it is. Heaven forbid anyone sees what a mess they've made of the place. You know what really gets me? I'm pretty sure they're paying someone to come by every day and check for violations. Like, they've got the money for that, but they can't be bothered to hire a decent landscaping company. It's ridiculous. When we first moved in, our place was one of the first buildings in the development. It looked fantastic. Everything was perfect. Now, it's like they've just given up. I keep thinking back to when we were house hunting. This place looked so promising. The model home was gorgeous. The common areas were immaculate. They sold us on this vision of a beautiful, well-maintained community, and for a while it was great. But now, it feels like we've been duped. It's like they put all their effort into making the place look good until they sold all the units, and now they just don't care anymore. The worst part is, we're still paying the same HOA fees we were when we moved in. Where's all that money going? Because it sure as hell isn't going into maintaining the property. I've tried talking to some of our neighbors about it. Most of them feel the same way, but everyone's scared to speak up. The HOA has a reputation for being pretty vindictive. No one wants to be the one to rock the boat. But honestly, I'm getting to the point where I don't care anymore. Something needs to change. We can't keep living like this, walking on eggshells in our own home while the place falls apart around us. I've been thinking about running for the HOA board myself. Maybe if I can get in there, I can start making some changes from the inside. But then I think about all the bureaucracy and politics involved, and I just get tired. Sometimes I wonder if we should just cut our losses and move. But we put so much into this place. It was supposed to be our home for years to come. The thought of starting over somewhere else is exhausting. Plus, with the way the property looks now, I'm not sure we'd even be able to sell for a decent price. Who'd want to buy into this mess? I just don't know what to do anymore. It feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do we keep fighting? Do we give up and move? Or do we just resign ourselves to living in a place that gets worse every day? I know HOAs are supposed to protect property values and keep the neighborhood looking nice, but from where I'm standing, ours is doing the exact opposite. They're so focused on petty rules and regulations that they're missing the forest for the trees. I mean, what's the point of having strict rules about holiday decorations if the basic upkeep of the property is being neglected? It's like they're more concerned with power trips than actually doing their job. I've thought about trying to organize the other homeowners. Maybe if we all band together, we can force some changes. But getting people motivated is like herding cats. Everyone's got their own lives, their own problems. It's hard to get people to care about community issues when they're just trying to get through their day-to-day. So here I am, venting to whoever will listen. I know it probably won't change anything, but at least it makes me feel a little better to get it off my chest. If you're thinking about moving into an HOA community, take it from me. Look beyond the shiny exterior. Ask the tough questions. Because once you're in, it's a whole lot harder to get out. I don't know what the future holds for us and this place, But I do know one thing for sure. This HOA can take their petty rules and shove 'em. I'm done playing nice. From now on, if they want to complain about something, they'd better make damn sure they've got their facts straight first. And maybe, just maybe, they should take a look at their own failings before pointing fingers at the rest of us. Don't listen to them. They're total crap heads. Honestly, I'd threaten to sue their asses for religious discrimination over the Christmas lights complaint. It's completely ridiculous that they would go after you for something as harmless and joyful as holiday decorations. Not only is it an invasion of your personal expression, but it also reeks of bias. By taking a firm stand and showing them that you're willing to take legal action, you'll make them think twice before trying to screw with you again in the future. They need to understand that their nitpicking and harassment won't go unchecked, and that there are serious consequences for their actions. Imagine the look on their faces when they realize they're messing with someone who knows their rights and isn't afraid to defend them. That kind of bold stance could make them tread much more lightly and reconsider their ridiculous power trips. People are really forgetting the first rule when it comes to buying property in association HOA. Read the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, thoroughly before you even consider putting in a bid. This crucial step is often overlooked, but it's essential for understanding what you're getting into when joining an HOA community. The CC&Rs are legally binding documents that outline the rules, regulations, and expectations for property owners within the association. They cover everything from architectural guidelines and maintenance responsibilities to use restrictions and assessment obligations. If, after carefully reviewing these documents, you still find yourself willing to live under such conditions, then by all means proceed, but do so with your eyes wide open. However, don't stop there. Once you're familiar with the CC&Rs, use that knowledge to your advantage. Don't simply take the HOA board's word for it when they claim you're doing something wrong or violating a rule. Always refer back to the specific language in the CC&Rs. Seek clarification on ambiguous points, and be prepared to challenge inconsistent enforcement if necessary. Remember, HOA boards can sometimes misinterpret or misapply the rules, whether intentionally or not. By being well informed about the CC&Rs, you position yourself as an empowered homeowner who can effectively advocate for your rights within the community. This knowledge serves as a powerful tool in maintaining a harmonious living environment while protecting your interests. In essence, doing your due diligence before purchasing and staying informed afterwards can save you from countless headaches and potential conflicts in the future. Just to preface, yes, this did take place in the USA, and no, I won't say where. I live bordering a former HOA. It shut down about a year ago. My property is the closest one to them, but far enough away that it does not fall in their jurisdiction since I am not on their street. My property is next to their street, and my driveway enters from the main road. The HOA's road is more than a half mile of houses. Some really old, but the street was redeveloped in the 90s or so, and after that an HOA was started. You go from a country road and then take a right turn and bam, you're in semi-suburbia. There are large farms on each side of the former HOA road. The oldest houses were among those owned by the HOA board, and there is also an old small elementary school that was converted into a home by one of the board members. And that was also where the HOA had all their meetings. When I moved into the area a couple of years ago, it was because I'd come into some money from inheritance and decided to buy a semi-suburban small-town property that had been vacant for several years after the previous house that was on it burned down. The land itself was cheap and heavily overgrown with brush. Once cleared out, I had a manufactured home put there. There was even an existing chain-link fence with a gate that kept the property lines well divided. I had enough inheritance money to pay for about 50% of all this without affecting my prior savings, and the rest I had to take on a mortgage for. It's just the sort of property I wanted. A little place of my own where I can work remotely, and if I ever have to move, I can probably sell the place for roughly 3 times what I paid for it. But I hope to stay here as long as I can. I'm the type who likes to stay firmly planted somewhere, and I hate traveling. I'd only been living in my current abode for a few days when I suddenly began getting trouble from the nearby HOA. The rotund HOA president showed up along with a couple of her board members on a trio of mobility scooters, like they were some kind of biker gang. They had notepads in hand and creepy smiles that I can only describe as looking like they already won from the moment they'd arrived. I made the mistake of leaving my gate unlocked, and they just let themselves in. But they quickly learned I was not going to let them force me into joining their little club. Before I could even tell them to get out, they'd already spread out. The president was giving me a pitch that the HOA was mandatory, and the other two people started telling me about all the bylaws I was supposedly in violation of. One of them being the state of my grass, which was at the time almost non-existent because the ground had been leveled and reseeded when my house was set up. I had none of their attitudes and told them to leave. They refused and said they had a right to be there, and actually stated that my information from real estate that my property wasn't in their jurisdiction was wrong. I told them that was a stupid lie, and to get off my property. They refused to leave, so I had enough and went into my house, then came back out my old .22 rifle I've had since I was a kid and threatened them with it. It's just a .22, but it's not a small rifle. So it looks intimidating enough. They lost their minds in panic at the sight of the rifle and actually called the police on me instead of clearing out when I told them to. But the police sided with me after they arrived because the HOA board were all trespassing, and I was fully within my rights to defend my own property. The stunned looks on their faces were gold when the police took my side and told them to leave me alone since I was not in their HOA. The president whined about it repeatedly. But it did nothing because the cops also agreed I was not in the HOA's area of control, and they were overreaching their authority. Then they were all forced to leave. Somehow they thought I'd be a pushover just because I look young. I was 36 at the time, and people still often mistake me for being mid-20s. I had a baby face growing up and even tried growing a mustache for a while to look more mature. Didn't work out very well. The HOA didn't quit trying to make me join. At first I was just getting membership applications in the mail. But then they started getting more passive-aggressive. One of the board members even waited for me at my gate about a couple of weeks after the first incident, just to tell me that my refusing to conform was ruining neighborhood moral. I reminded him I'm not in his neighborhood, and he told me he could have me shunned if I didn't join. I actually laughed at him for that. I bought a country property to be left alone. Go ahead and shun me. I've got my own friends in the nearby city if I want to see them. Then told the guy to stay away from my property, and if he ever trespassed again, I'd have him arrested. Right after that I started getting warnings in the mail for supposed infractions I'd committed. They actually sent me repeated warnings over the reseeded grass. Did they not understand how newly planted grass grows? It takes a while to fill in. Then it stopped being warnings, and they sent me a long list of fines they expected me to pay. The fines were for me for having a gate, the gate being yellow, preventing mandatory inspection of my land and house, owning a firearm, having a car in the wrong color. My fence being old and rusty, it was already there when I bought the land. My fence being too tall, 6 feet. My driveway not being paved, it's gravel. And they didn't consider my recently installed at the time metal shed an approved building. But that wasn't all. There were more fines going back years to the previous property owners. And the period my property sat vacant and overgrown. They actually expected me to pay in total $30,000. I was especially livid after they had sent me that list of bogus fines because they'd have had to have trespassed on my property just to know some of the things they were fining me for. Honestly, I think they were just making up rules at some point to claim I'd broken them. I walked the neighborhood, and there were plenty of other rusty fences, patchy lawns, gravel driveways, cars the same color as mine, etc. I had to calm myself down with a drink, and then wrote a letter back stating I was not in the HOA, never will be, and would not pay anything to them, especially not for anything from before I ever even owned the property. I also made it clear their attempts to fine me were blatantly illegal, if not outright fraud, and would not hold up in court. After that, my garbage can was vandalized after I put it out before going to work. It looked like it had been cut up with an electric saw or something. I called the cops, but there was little they could do with no witnesses. I had enough and paid a security company to come set up cameras. The HOA board took notice of the work vehicle from the security company, as I saw the same 2 board members who previously harassed me sitting on scooters and watching from the end of my driveway. They clearly took my threat of retaliation seriously, because I got no more fake fines, and my trash can was never touched again. But they still kept sending me membership applications weekly, and even letters practically begging I just join to keep the peace. So I started mailing them back with "No" written in black Sharpie on the envelopes, and even a letter threatening to wipe my ass with their applications before sending them back, and even that didn't make it stop. For a while I could not for the life of me figure out why they were so desperate to make me join. Turned out their elderly woman-child of an HOA president had practically become obsessed with some crazy plan she was calling HOA zone expansion, and was making it a hill to die on since the HOA could not legally expand beyond its street without permission from surrounding property owners. And I highly doubt any of them would agree to join. I was just target number one because I was the closest, and they wanted to make an example of me. I just kept rebuffing the HOA's repeated attempts to contact me. Until one morning about 3 months after I'd moved in, I found my driveway blocked by a large transit van outside my gate. It was the HOA president, and she was blocking me in so she could personally make demands of me. I don't know why she bothered to use her van to block me in. She was already big as a whale and could have just stood there herself. I even started calling her President Whale behind her back because she was morbidly obese to the my 600-pound life level, and often wore blue and white. She had on what I can best describe as a business jacket over a muumuu dress, hair in a tight bun, big grandma glasses, and a beaded necklace with a big wooden cross hanging from her neck. And I'm not exaggerating when I say she usually had some kind of food in her hands. Like almost every time I saw her, even during this interaction she stopped to eat. From what I learned of her later, she was a widow, and her husband was an obese person like her, that ate himself into his grave during his 50s. As for President Whale, I do believe she had something very mentally wrong with her, but I wasn't sympathetic after what she tried to do to me. Back to her van blocking me in, I told President Whale to move her damn vehicle or I'd be calling the effing police on her. She scolded me like an old church lady for my choice of language and said she didn't have to move because the HOA owns the road, and since I refused to join the HOA or pay the fines, she was landlocking me in. Even I knew this was very illegal, and asked if she was mental, because I'm not even on the HOA's road. I'm on the main road the HOA road branches from. She refused to listen to me, so I started getting ready to call police. She tried to stop me from calling and claimed she just wanted to negotiate. I told her there was nothing to negotiate. She was blocking me in illegally, and I would be calling cops if she didn't move her van ASAP. But she pretended not to even hear me and said that if I just filled out the forms to join the HOA, all of my problems would go away. Then she went on to the HOA is so great sales pitch and refused to stop till I told her she was trying to act like a mafia boss, and the HOA was the source of all my problems she was claiming would go away. Then I said that all the junk food she was eating was rotting her brain. She called me a petulant child. I reminded her I was a grown-ass man, and she was a hypocrite to call me petulant when she was the one illegally blocking me in to try and blackmail me into joining her HOA. She had the nerve to say what she was doing was morally right, and for the good of the community. I said back that it wasn't, it was just to satisfy her own ego, and blackmail is illegal. I also pointed out she wasn't being a good Christian by wearing a cross and claiming such lies. She rolled up the HOA forms and aimed to swat me with them. I had enough and finally called the police. Whale started screaming at me to hang up the call while attempting to chase me around and hit me. But the slow pile of blubber couldn't even get near me. After only a couple of attempts she stopped and started wheezing, and then she started yelling to try and get the police on the phone to think I was attacking her. I called her out for this and reminded her I have cameras. She immediately stopped, and then waddled back to her van a tired, sweaty mess. We stared each other down for around 20 minutes while she sat in the side of her van and stuffed her face before the cops showed up. They were initially unsure what was going on, because of Whale's prior screaming when I called. But I had video from my dash cam and my house to show I'd never laid a finger on her. President Whale tried to make a big show of fake panic and said I was dangerous. But the police told her to move her van as she was illegally blocking my driveway. She refused and said the road was the HOA's. But the cops said it wasn't the first time they'd been called because of her harassment in the area, and also stated that the road she was currently on was not the HOA's road, and the road the HOA itself is on is county-owned, not private, which was news to me, but it meant she couldn't do this even if I was on the HOA's road. Then she was bluntly told she cannot block access to anyone, and to move the van right away or be cited. She tried to argue further, so they ticketed her on the spot and threatened to arrest her and have the van towed if she didn't comply. She gave us all death glares and finally moved the van. I arrived to work about an hour late that day, but with an interesting story to tell. Not too long later, I was served a small claims lawsuit from Whale. She was suing me for the cost of the fine she had to pay for the citation police gave her, and for emotional distress I caused that was affecting her health. I pretty much looked at the letter and laughed, because I was ready to pick that land whale apart in court. But then the HOA tried another dirty move around the same time. I was soon notified by my bank that someone was attempting to put a lien on my property for $30,000. The same amount as what the HOA tried to previously fine me. I finally got a lawyer, and the lien was soon cancelled because it was groundless. I filed counter lawsuits against Whale and the HOA for harassment. I also personally went to see the HOA board at their next meeting to tell them off for what they'd tried to do, and that I'd see them in court. Whale actually had one of those little wooden gavel mallets, and was repeatedly striking it on the table that she was sitting at. She pounded it on the table while yelling "no" every time I tried to speak. The rest of the HOA board had to tell her to stop, and even took the gavel from her hand like she was a child that needed a timeout. She went on a tangent about how she was in charge, but the rest of the board told her she needed to pack up and go home for the day. But she refused and just sat there with her arms crossed and pouting. I talked with the rest of the board, and they tried to deny any involvement in the past things Whale had done to me, including the attempted lien, which was only her doing apparently. I called those as outright lies, and pointed out how several of the board members had previously harassed me in person along with Whale at my house, and they were also likely the ones who snuck onto my property to write more fines until I put cameras up. Because I certainly wouldn't figure Whale was the one climbing over my gate and trudging around like that with how fat she is. I then said I was suing them for the harassment, fake fines, and attempted lien on my property and my destroyed trash can if I could prove it. I'd see them in court to take them for everything I could because they were royally effed. Their faces all seemed to get flushed, save for Whale. She was puffy and red like a ripe tomato. I was then politely asked to leave so they could deliberate. Not long after that, things came to an abrupt halt. Only a few days after I'd went to see the HOA board, President Whale was found dead in her home from a fatal heart attack. Apparently it had been brought on by stress and binge eating, because the board had refused to stand by her and voted to dismiss her as HOA president after I told them I was suing. I heard she had a full-on child tantrum. I only wish I'd still been there to see it. Apparently she begged them to reconsider, and they packed her things for her and made her leave sobbing. She went home and then died on her couch while binge-eating cake. She lived alone, so nobody found her for days, and the morgue had a hell of a time getting her remains out of the house. She was in her mid-60s and morbidly obese with a serious junk food addiction, so she was basically one Twinkie away from kicking the bucket at any time. My lawsuit against the HOA ended when they agreed to settle out of court after Whale's death. They basically blamed everything on her. They claimed the fines and false lien were only her doing, though I still don't really believe that. But the board wormed out of any serious consequences since it was Whale's name on all the paperwork. In the settlement, the HOA paid all my legal fees, repaid the cost of my having to get CCTV cameras installed, and gave me a few $1,000s on top of all that as a show of good faith. But Whale's family decided they were going to come after both me and the HOA. They tried to sue both me and them for causing Whale's death. But the judge threw both cases out before they even went to court. I ended up getting a few anonymous threatening letters taped to my gate talking about things like breaking my legs, and the houses of each HOA board member got vandalized too. My mailbox was also ripped up out of the ground in the middle of the night. Joke was on them. I get all of my mail through a P.O. box. Sadly, I didn't have a camera at the end of the driveway to see who did it. I'd previously tried putting a trail cam there, but passing cars set it off all day and night. So I removed it. The mailbox was only really there as an address marker anyway, and wasn't hard for me to replace. But tampering with a mailbox, even one that's basically just for display, is a federal offense. It couldn't be proven it was Whale's family that did it, as there were no cameras or witnesses that saw anything, and my mailbox was never found. But Whale's family vandalizing of the HOA board members' houses were all provable, as there were cameras there, and those idiots didn't bother to cover their faces when they did all that damage. Some arrests were made, and a lot of restraining orders were filed. Whale's family finally sold her house and left. Guess they weren't stupid enough to go against a restraining order. I just replaced my display mailbox with one from Home Depot, and that's pretty much where the entire mess ends for me. The whole situation was too much for the HOA though, and the residents passed a motion to shut it down completely. The HOA served no real function for comfort, as there were no paid-for common areas like a park or a pool. All meetings were held at the house of one of the board members, which, as I said, used to be a small school. There were accusations of repeated election rigging, as the board had remained the same for a long time despite the fact they were so hated, and there were threats of an audit too. The board didn't fight the shutdown because they were all on the verge of being removed by force, so they were ready to throw in the towel. A couple of them even moved away, one of which I heard said that I had ruined everything, and the neighborhood was going to hell without the HOA. The former board were all retired busybodies anyway. The only one that's any semblance of liked is the one whose house used to be a school and the HOA meeting building. They opened the gym room so locals could come in and play basketball on the regular. Their kids love it especially. I've been living peacefully here ever since, and I have actually made some friends. I didn't intend to, but I stopped to talk with neighbors a few times while out riding my bike, and it just went on from there. I've even been invited to a few barbecues and even a birthday party. Life is good. Not that unbelievable that she was fat. I just got turned off by the writer's obsession with her fatness. Like, yeah, I get it. She's big. Did you have to include the details about her having a heart attack while gorging herself on cake, or the people taking her body having trouble getting her out of her home? That's not something you needed to add. Yeah, it could be true, but even if it was, I certainly didn't want to hear it. Yeah, everyone involved with the HOA being in mobility scooters, and obese was the clincher that this was fake. Then everything about President Whale made it even more obvious. Hating HOAs and hating fat people. Name a more iconic Reddit duo. For me, it was when they claimed a manufactured home would triple the value of the property. They obviously have never looked into manufactured homes, as they are usually considered personal property, not real estate property, and their value depreciates quickly, unlike a regular home which appreciates in value.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.